They ruled empires, commanded armies, and carved their names into the marble of history. But behind every crown was a secret, sometimes in the shadows, sometimes in plain sight. This is the story of the sons and daughters they never named, the ones denied titles, erased from portraits, and hidden in plain view. Because when you're born to a throne, but not to a queen, your life begins as a secret, and sometimes ends as one too. Welcome to 30 royals who had children they never acknowledged, where bloodlines blur and legacies lie. Before we dive into these shadowy royal bloodlines, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss the stories history tried to forget. And while you're here, drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Midnight in Madrid? Dawn in Delhi? We're always curious who's out there in the dark with us. Charles II of England. He was called the Merry Monarch, but that was only because the court historians didn't have the audacity to call him what everyone else was thinking: the monarchy's most prolific distraction. Charles II of England didn't rule a kingdom so much as he hosted a decades-long after-party to the English Civil War, complete with masks, mistresses, and metaphors that everyone politely ignored. Restoration England was drunk on relief. The puritanical shadows of Cromwell had finally retreated, and the people welcomed back their king with the same giddy desperation of someone reactivating their tinder after a religious retreat. Charles, for his part, took full advantage of the moral elasticity of the moment. He had more mistresses than ministers, more bastards than bureaucrats, and possibly more aliases than acknowledged heirs. Officially, he recognized around a dozen illegitimate children. Unofficially, the number bloats and buckles under historical gossip, disputed claims, and the creaky infrastructure of 17th century birth records. He acknowledged James Scott, Duke of Monmouth. He acknowledged Charles FitzCharles, Duke of Cambridge. He acknowledged Charles Fitzroy, Duke of Southampton. If you had the name Charles and a particularly symmetrical jawline, odds were good you'd be awarded a title and a polite nod at court. It was a strange kind of meritocracy, one in which bone structure occasionally trumped bloodline, and legitimacy was a matter of charisma more than chromosomes. But what about the others? The quiet ones, the overlooked ones, the ones whose mothers were perhaps a little too low-born, or a little too inconvenient, or a little too Catholic. The children who carried whispers of royal descent in their cheekbones, but no names to match. Charles had no legitimate heirs with his wife, Catherine of Braganza, and this emptiness in the official lineage gave his illegitimate children a strange kind of luminous shadow, a presence that both haunted and hollowed the throne. Enter the case of Lady Barbara Fitzroy. Born in 1672 to Barbara Palmer, one of Charles's most infamous mistresses, she was allegedly his daughter. Allegedly. Unlike her half-brothers who were paraded through court with heraldry and house sigils, Lady Barbara got no titles, no lands, no official nod. Nothing but a claim, an ambiguous shrug from the king, and a scandalous mother's word. Barbara Fitzroy was sent off to a convent in France. Whether this was an act of piety or punishment remains a mystery soaked in rosary beads and royal silence. She later became a nun, which, depending on your interpretation, was either a spiritual calling or a strategic form of exile. Either way, her royal blood, if she had it, was buried under a vow of silence. Then there's the phantom known as James de la Cloche, a man who appeared in Italy claiming to be Charles II's secret son from a youthful escapade in Jersey during his exile. His story was riddled with inconsistencies, like a drunk memoir written in invisible ink. He said he was sent to study in Naples, that Charles promised him protection, that there was a secret network ensuring his survival. He vanished not long after. Some say he was an imposter, a con artist with a well-researched backstory. Others whisper he was the real deal, silenced not by poverty, but by politics. Charles never confirmed de la Cloche's story, but he also never denied it outright. That was his gift, really, a talent for ambiguity so polished it might as well have been enshrined in Westminster. He could wink at a scandal without marrying it. He could elevate a child to nobility with one hand and erase another with the other, all while sipping wine and quoting Virgil. Historians like to focus on his politics, his dealings with France, his secret Catholicism, the exclusion crisis. But behind the paperwork and palace intrigue was a royal man obsessed with performance. Everything was theatre. The court was a stage. The monarchy, after being temporarily dismantled, had to be remade as spectacle, and his children, those he chose to acknowledge and those he didn't, were props in that performance. A public gesture of virility here, a quiet disavowal there. The stage lights never reached the convent corridors or the back alleys of London, where unacknowledged sons and daughters grew up with royal faces and common names, which raises the more disturbing question. How many people walked the muddy streets of London completely unaware that they shared blood with the king? How many quietly disappeared into wars, workhouses, and whispers? And if a monarch can shape history with the flick of a quill, how easily can he erase a person? But before you mourn the erased, meet another royal who did it with a little more calculation. A man from Monaco, surrounded by yachts and secrets, who spent decades playing a different kind of royal roulette, with paternity tests, media scandals, and a daughter named Jasmine. Prince Albert II of Monaco, in the glittering, hyper-sanitized aquarium of Monaco, that slippery tax haven masquerading as a country. Royal scandal isn't so much cleaned up as it is marinated in public relations strategy. Enter Prince Albert II, son of Hollywood royalty Grace Kelly and long-reigning Prince Rainier III. With that kind of pedigree, you'd think the line between fantasy and real life would be clear, but when it came to Albert's children, even reality got edited. To the casual observer, Prince Albert of Monaco was a bachelor prince with a taste for expensive sports and international diplomacy. Behind the scenes, the man had a complicated relationship with fatherhood. Not the act of becoming one, he'd managed that multiple times before his marriage, but the act of admitting it. Let's start with Jasmine Grace Grimaldi, born in 1992 in California. Her mother, Tamara Rotolo, was a waitress vacationing on the French Riviera when she met Prince Albert. The resulting affair was fleeting, the child not. Jasmine was raised in the US, growing up far from the yachts and marble corridors of the Palais Princier. For most of her childhood, she heard whispers of her royal blood without ever seeing it acknowledged. Albert refused to recognize Jasmine publicly until 2006, 14 years after her birth, and not coincidentally, just before taking the throne officially following the death of his father. One can almost hear the advisors whispering, "Clean the slate, mop up the headlines. Acknowledge the American kid, the one with Grace Kelly's eyes." He did, and the world, predictably, turned it into a fairy tale. The lost princess discovered. The Hollywood bloodline continued. Photos of Jasmine surfaced, singing opera, attending charity events, smiling like she hadn't just spent her formative years as Monaco's most inconvenient reality. Her existence had gone from tabloid footnote to brand asset. But she wasn't alone. Just 2 years after publicly acknowledging Jasmine, Prince Albert confirmed that he had another child, Alexandra Grimaldi, born in 2003 to Nicole Coste, a former Air France flight attendant from Togo. Unlike Jasmine, Alexandra had been raised in Europe, and his paternity had been a more open secret among the Monegasque elite. The problem, he was still officially invisible, at least until Albert's lawyers made the announcement with all the warmth of a corporate earnings report. This time, the palace's messaging was noticeably colder. Yes, he was Albert's son. No, he would not be in line for the throne. Yes, he would be financially supported. No, his mother would not be marrying the prince. It was a press release dressed in paternal language, a royal shrug typed in Helvetica. And while the world squinted at the footnotes, Albert went on to marry Charlene Whitstock, a South African Olympic swimmer, in a lavish wedding that was half James Bond, half hostage situation. By then, his two previously unacknowledged children were old news. Jasmine popped up in society pages, occasionally praised for her poise. Alexandra remained more private, his story entangled in quieter questions about race, class, and the invisible boundaries of Monaco's aristocracy. Here's the part most people miss. Neither child was kept secret because of love, nor revealed because of guilt. They were disclosed because the pressure made it impossible not to. Paternity became a chess piece in the larger game of optics. The children weren't scandalous. What was scandalous was how the royal machinery calibrated when and how to admit they existed, and the justifications always came wrapped in legalese. Monaco's constitution doesn't allow illegitimate children to inherit the throne. The Grimaldi bloodline must remain pure, at least on paper, but in practice, the family tree is more of a family web, stretching in directions it refuses to admit, tethered to names that don't get engraved in marble. Albert has since said that he's trying to maintain relationships with both children. There are occasional public appearances, hints of reconciliation, carefully cropped photographs. It's a sort of sanitized acknowledgement, like royalty admitting it's human, but only when the lighting is good. But the emotional reality is harder to manage. Imagine growing up with the knowledge that your father is a prince, not metaphorically, not mythically, but literally, and still not seeing your face in the family portraits. Imagine knowing you exist because of the same bloodline that once built castles, but you're not allowed past the gates. Jasmine once said in an interview that she didn't want to be hidden away. A simple sentence, a devastating one. Because to be hidden is not the same as being forgotten. It is worse. It is to be remembered selectively, when convenient, and discarded when not. And Albert, for all his talk of modernity and diplomacy, he did what royals have done for centuries. He compartmentalized, he managed, he delayed acknowledgement until denial was more costly. The only difference is his story came with press releases and paparazzi. But the pattern is old, ancient even. And the next royal on our list played the same game for years. Only this one wasn't just a prince, he was a king, and unlike Monaco's polished facade, his kingdom was weighed down by dynastic shame, noble lawsuits, and a daughter named Delphine, who refused to disappear. Two kings, two very different kinds of silence, one draped in velvet, the other in legal fog. And yet, both left behind children whose names barely made it past a footnote. If you're still with us deep in the royal archives, don't forget to subscribe. There's a lot more hidden history where this came from. And while you're at it, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it? Are you wide awake at noon in New York or half asleep in Tokyo at 3 a.m? We see you, night owls. King Albert II of Belgium. Royal scandals in Belgium don't tend to erupt. They simmer quietly, carefully, like a pot that never quite boils, even though everyone in the room can smell what's inside. For decades, the story of King Albert II and his secret daughter, Delphine Boel, lingered in that exact state of half-known discomfort, hovering in tabloids, dismissed by courtiers, denied with a diplomatic smile. Albert II wasn't supposed to be king in the first place. His elder brother, King Baudouin, ruled for over 40 years without issue. When Baudouin died in 1993, Albert, then known mostly as a playboy prince with a motorbike habit and a tendency to vanish on holidays, was reluctantly crowned. And from the very beginning, the Belgian monarchy felt fragile, symbolic, half-finished. So when Delphine Boel, an artist living in Brussels, began insisting publicly in the early 2000s that she was Albert's illegitimate daughter, the palace reacted not with outrage, but with a kind of sterile denial. It was beneath them to answer, which is another way of saying they didn't have a good answer. Delphine wasn't just another name in the press. She had a story, a detailed one. Her mother, Baroness Sibylle de Senlis-Longchamp, had allegedly had a long-term affair with Albert while he was still Prince of Liège, long before he became king. Not a one-night scandal, a relationship, one that lasted over a decade, during which Delphine was born in 1968. The details were uncomfortable, not because they were especially salacious, but because they were especially plausible. There were photos, there were family friends who confirmed the relationship. There was, most damningly, Delphine herself, a woman who bore an undeniable resemblance to her alleged father. But still, Albert refused to acknowledge her. Legally, Delphine had no standing. She was just a citizen. She had no title, no inheritance rights, no claim. But unlike many so-called royal bastards before her, she didn't fade away. She didn't retreat into privacy or wait for posthumous vindication. She fought. She took the king to court. Let's pause on that image for a moment. A monarch, constitutionally protected and surrounded by centuries of tradition, being summoned by his alleged daughter to submit to a DNA test. It was more than a family dispute. It was a structural crisis for a monarchy already wobbling on symbolic stilts. At first, the legal strategy was silence, then obstruction. Albert's lawyers fought tooth and nail to prevent the test from happening. They argued protocol, privacy, privilege. But in 2013, something shifted. King Albert II abdicated, citing health reasons. His son, Philippe, took the throne, and just like that, the legal shield dropped. Freed from the constitutional protections of the crown, Albert was now a private citizen, and the court ordered him to take the test. In 2020, nearly 52 years after Delphine's birth, the DNA results came back. Albert II was her biological father. The truth, delayed for decades, arrived in the form of a cold, scientific percentage. No more denials, no more elegant silences, just data, inarguable and deeply human. Delphine was formally recognized. The courts ruled she was entitled to the name Saxe-Coburg, the royal family name. In 2021, she was officially granted the title Princess of Belgium, along with the style Her Royal Highness. Not because of her father's affection, but because the law demanded it. There were no warm photo ops, no reconciliatory interviews. The royal family released a terse statement acknowledging the ruling. Albert, to this day, has given little indication of emotional closure. The monarchy moved on, polished, recalibrated, still smiling. But the story doesn't reset so easily. Delphine's story is a reversal of everything the royal brand tries to preserve. Royal families thrive on the illusion of divine legitimacy, of chosen heirs, perfect unions, unbroken bloodlines. But here was a daughter who broke that mythology using the most modern tool imaginable, a DNA swab. And unlike other unacknowledged children of royalty, Delphine didn't remain a shadow. She became a symbol not of scandal, but of persistence, of the stubborn belief that truth matters more than titles, that your father, being a king, doesn't mean he's above the consequences of being a man. And for Belgium, the consequences were subtle but seismic. The monarchy had always existed in a delicate balance between ceremony and irrelevance. Delphine's case reminded the country that behind the velvet curtains and constitutional niceties were real people, fallible ones, capable of love, neglect, denial, and eventually forced acknowledgement. Which brings us, almost poetically, to a man who learned nothing from his father, a man whose own secrets echo like a less sophisticated sequel, a Belgian prince who also had a child and tried to pretend he didn't, until the story cracked open, just like his father's, and spilled into the tabloids with the quiet fury of inherited denial. Prince Laurent of Belgium. If the Belgian monarchy were a carefully managed brand, conservative, understated, mildly allergic to disruption, then Prince Laurent was the glitch in the logo. The spare heir of a spare heir, Laurent never had much to do in the royal hierarchy. except unintentionally remind everyone why monarchies are usually scripted in advance and edited in post. You could call him a royal eccentric. That's the polite term. The tabloids had other words, but even they weren't quite sure what to make of him. He once flew to Congo without permission, crashed a UN event, got caught up in an illegal logging scandal, and was reportedly obsessed with animal rights to the point where some wondered if he'd rather hug trees than shake hands. But of all his missteps, the most quietly destabilizing one came not from politics or jet-setting or questionable hairstyles. It came from fatherhood, specifically a son he didn't publicly acknowledge for years. A child whose existence was cloaked not in denial, but in silence. Let's wind it back. In 2023, a Belgian woman named Letitia came forward with a revelation. Her now 23-year-old son had been fathered by Prince Laurent in the year 2000. The prince had known, he'd been informed, there had even been private discussions. But when it came to public recognition, acknowledging the child in court, granting his name, or giving any kind of formal acknowledgement, Laurent had simply opted out. The details were blurry, as they often are in royal paternity cases. The palace refused to comment. The media tiptoed. Laurent issued a brief, non-committal statement that managed to sound both legally defensive and emotionally blank. But the truth lingered in the margins. There was a son, and there was a prince who did not publicly call him one. Why not? That's the quiet question that hangs in the air like old perfume. Maybe it was pressure. Maybe it was protocol. Maybe it was a deal made in private with terms never disclosed. Or maybe, like so many other royals before him, Laurent simply didn't know how to integrate inconvenient truths into a family narrative designed for glossy portraits and ceremonial parades. Unlike his father, Albert II, whose paternity scandal with Delphine Boel spanned decades and ended in reluctant royal recognition, Laurent was not the king. He was not even particularly influential. His name often appeared in the press more as a footnote than a headline. And yet the emotional damage of that silence was just as profound, because the monarchy, even in its waning power, still teaches something by example. And when a prince chooses not to acknowledge his own child publicly, it sends a message. Legitimacy is optional, but silence is mandatory. It wasn't just that the boy was unacknowledged, it was that for years his existence didn't matter in the public conversation about the royal family. There was no slot for him in the annual Christmas photos, no space for him in the line of succession, no category on the palace website's family tree, just absence. Institutional, cold, deeply intentional absence. And yet, the irony writes itself. Prince Laurent himself has always claimed to be misunderstood, an outsider in his own family, a man who never quite fit into the roles laid out for him. He often speaks about his sense of isolation, about being judged for who he is rather than what he does, which makes his reluctance to acknowledge his own child not just a mystery, but a contradiction so bitter it practically begs for a Greek chorus. Here was a prince, long estranged from the inner circle of monarchy, with a son whose existence mirrored his own marginalization. And still, he said nothing, did nothing, let the silence expand until someone else, always someone else, spoke first. In many ways, this is the royal blueprint. Not denial exactly, not cruelty even, just silence, polished and procedural. A long history of royals learning how to disappear their mistakes by folding them into legalese and hoping the public gets distracted by a parade. But silence isn't neutral, it's a decision. And in the case of Laurent's son, it created a vacuum, one that sucked in dignity, identity, and a sense of belonging that every child deserves, even when their father happens to wear a crown. No formal titles were requested. No inheritance was demanded. The child, by all accounts, lived a private life. But the emotional mathematics of the situation were impossible to ignore. The prince knew, and for over 2 decades, he said nothing. Eventually, as with most things royal and unresolved, the media cycle moved on. The child remained, the silence remained, and the monarchy, already burdened by the lingering fallout from Albert II's case, tightened its grip on discretion. But denial has a lineage too, and it rarely ends where it begins, because before Prince Laurent, before Albert II, before the modern etiquette of palace lawyers and DNA tests, there was a different kind of royal scandal, a whisper born in velvet-draped rooms and whispered through scandalous diaries. A girl named Barbara, born centuries earlier to a king who sired many but named few. Lady Barbara Fitzroy. History tends to remember kings. Occasionally it remembers their mistresses, but it almost never remembers the children caught between the two, especially when those children are inconvenient, especially when they are female, especially when their very existence makes the royal bloodline look a little too human. Lady Barbara Fitzroy was born in 1672, the last child of Barbara Palmer, the notorious first Duchess of Cleveland and, allegedly, the daughter of Charles II of England, allegedly. That word clings to her story like mildew, because Charles, ever the political acrobat, never officially recognized her as his, and in the world of monarchy, unofficial is the polite term for erased. To understand Barbara Fitzroy, you have to understand her mother. Barbara Palmer was not just any mistress. She was the mistress, bold, brash, politically dangerous, and famously beautiful. She wielded influence at court like a saber, earning both titles and enemies. Charles adored her, until he didn't. Their relationship, which began before his coronation, had produced several children that he did acknowledge, even elevating them with titles and wealth. But Barbara Fitzroy was born at a time when the king's attention was wandering. By 1672, Charles had taken new mistresses. Barbara Palmer was falling out of favour, and so when she gave birth to another child, claiming it was the king's, Charles did what royals have always done when faced with personal inconvenience. He dodged. The official silence surrounding Barbara's paternity wasn't an act of clarity, it was an act of ambiguity weaponized. Charles didn't publicly deny her, but he didn't confirm her either. She grew up in a kind of royal purgatory, half claimed, half erased, and the court, always eager for gossip, filled in the blanks with its usual cruel creativity. There were whispers that Barbara Fitzroy resembled the king, sharply in fact. Some claimed she had his eyes, his mouth, his stubborn tilt of the head, but she didn't receive a dukedom like her half-brothers. She wasn't paraded through the court. She was given a name, a title by courtesy, and a slow slide into obscurity. She was, for all intents and purposes, a royal child without a royal role. But Barbara's story takes an unexpected turn, one that reads more like literary tragedy than political scandal. As she entered adolescence, she made a decision that shocked even those accustomed to royal unpredictability. She became a nun, not just a cloistered noblewoman avoiding marriage, but a full-fledged member of the Benedictine order in France. In 1691, at just 19 years old, she took the veil at the English Benedictine convent in Pontoise and later became prioress, a position of considerable authority. Imagine that, the alleged daughter of one of England's most libertine monarchs, rejecting court life entirely in favour of silence, prayer, and withdrawal. It's either deeply ironic or quietly poetic, depending on how much you believe in escape narratives. And maybe that's what Barbara was doing, escaping from the rumours, from the half-acknowledgement, from the court that celebrated her brothers while letting her slip into historical footnotes. In a world where daughters were political pawns or ornamental accessories, Barbara chose the only path that allowed her to define her own identity. Historians still debate her paternity. Some speculate she was actually the child of Barbara Palmer's lover, John Churchill, who would later become the Duke of Marlborough. Others say she was too closely guarded, too eerily similar to Charles to be anyone else's. The truth, as with most things royal and unresolved, lies somewhere between the records and the silences. What we do know is that Barbara Fitzroy's name rarely appears in the official ledgers of the monarchy. Her story doesn't end in scandal or rebellion or tragic romance. It ends in stone cloisters, in quiet leadership, in the subtle assertion of selfhood. She died in 1737, having spent nearly her entire life inside the convent's walls. There's a strange dignity in that. Not everyone born of kings wants to inherit their world. Some would rather disappear from it completely, and in doing so, say more than any royal decree ever could. But Barbara's half-life in the royal shadow tells us something else too, that silence from a father, especially a king, is not neutral. It reshapes a life, it alters identity, destiny, memory. Charles II had acknowledged children born of mistresses both high and low, children he gave titles and lands and legacy. Barbara was not one of them. And that omission, centuries later, still echoes. Because even a king known for excess and indulgence drew lines when it came to paternity. Even the merry monarch had moments where joy gave way to calculation. And even as the court moved on, Lady Barbara stood as proof that being born of royalty means nothing if the crown chooses to forget you. But not all children of Charles II were quite so easily brushed aside. Some came with mysteries so deep, so theatrically improbable, that even now historians argue whether they ever existed at all. And yet, one such figure keeps surfacing, like a shadow behind the curtain. A man with a French education, Jesuit leanings, and the audacity to claim he was the king's hidden heir. His name? James de la Cloche. Charles II. Again, James de la Cloche. There are illegitimate children, and then there are ghost children. And then, standing somewhere between history and hallucination, there's James de la Cloche, a man who claimed to be the secret son of Charles II of England, and whose very existence still flickers like a gas lamp in a fogged mirror. Not confirmed, not denied, just strange. Royal bloodlines are already confusing. This one is downright spectral. To be clear, we're not retreading the previous story. Yes, Charles II sired plenty of children, and acknowledged a surprising number of them, considering he never produced a legitimate heir with Queen Catherine of Braganza. But James de la Cloche wasn't one of the lucky few to get a dukedom or a parade. His claim was different, weirder, political, spiritual, almost cinematic. The earliest records of de la Cloche appear in the 1660s. According to his story, and it is his story for the most part, he was born during Charles's exile on the island of Jersey before the king was restored to the throne. The mother? Unknown. The circumstances? Shadowy. The implications? Vast. James de la Cloche claimed that Charles knew of his existence and arranged for him to be educated abroad in secrecy. He said that the king had given him documents of safe passage and instructed him to study theology under a false name. He said that Charles had plans for him, spiritual missions, political tasks, maybe even a quiet place in the royal succession should the winds of fate shift. He wasn't alone in this belief either. Letters exist, tantalizing, disputed, often dismissed, in which Charles II refers to "my son James." Some have claimed they are forgeries. Others argue they're authentic but refer to someone else entirely. Either way, the ambiguity has become part of the legend. James was a Jesuit, or at least he pretended to be. That detail alone turns this from an obscure historical curiosity into a geopolitical migraine. England at the time was a Protestant nation only barely tolerating Catholicism. Charles himself was suspected of Catholic sympathies, suspicions later confirmed when he converted on his deathbed. But to father a Jesuit, that would have been not just scandalous, it would have been treason adjacent. And this is where things start to feel like a Restoration-era spy thriller. At one point, James de la Cloche allegedly travelled under the alias Henri de Rohan, appearing in Naples, then later in Hamburg, and possibly even Paris. He moved through courts and monasteries with the slippery confidence of someone who believed the world owed him more than it was giving. He presented letters, he claimed royal sanction, he hinted at secret missions, at papal intrigues, at hidden roles in English politics. But then, as quickly as he appeared, he vanished. Vanished not metaphorically, but physically. One moment he was a mysterious young man with ambiguous credentials, the Maui. Next he was gone. No grave, no confirmed death, just a swirl of rumour, confusion, and dusty archival trails that lead nowhere. What makes James de la Cloche compelling isn't whether he was telling the truth. It's that we still don't know. He wasn't a con man in the traditional sense. He didn't use his claim to seize power or extort money or gain access to palaces. He didn't rally troops or claim titles. If he was lying, it was a very inefficient lie. If he was telling the truth, it was a truth designed to be buried. And so the historians split, as they always do. Some argue that he was simply another delusional pretender, a man caught up in Restoration-era chaos who mistook paperwork for paternity. Others see in him the echoes of real scandal, a king with a secret Catholic son, a potential embarrassment hidden by exile, ecclesiastical loopholes, and European travel documents. One particularly strange theory links James de la Cloche to the legend of the man in the Iron Mask. That enigmatic prisoner whose identity was so secret he was kept masked for decades in French custody. The theory goes that perhaps James, if he was truly Charles's son, became a liability, a threat to both English and French political equilibrium. So he was disappeared, not killed, just tucked away behind velvet and iron. That theory is flimsy, but not impossible, because royal history is often written not by the victors, but by the survivors. And James de la Cloche did not survive long enough to write his own ending. What he left behind was something more haunting, a portrait of what it means to be a royal without recognition, to carry a lineage you can't prove, to wander Europe as a living maybe, too dangerous to be admitted, too obscure to be remembered. And yet, somehow his ghost lingers. You can still find obscure biographies trying to place him in the family tree, often with question marks instead of branches. You can still see the archival scans of the letters, with their seals, their signatures, their maddening ambiguity. Which begs the real question. If you were a king, and you had a son who could ruin your carefully cultivated image, what would you do? Deny him, hide him, or write him out of history entirely? Charles II was a master of ambiguity. He kept secrets the way some people collect art, with pride and with the full knowledge that one day someone would try to appraise them. But ambiguity didn't begin with Charles. It didn't end with James de la Cloche. And it certainly didn't stay in England, because while the British were busy veiling royal children in mystery, another king across Europe was producing them in bulk, with strength, pride, and just enough denial to fill a cathedral. His name was Augustus II the Strong, and his problem wasn't hiding royal offspring, it was finding enough courts to put them in. Augustus II the Strong, Elector of Saxony, King of Poland. Some kings leave behind legacies, others leave behind architecture. Augustus II of Saxony and Poland, known to history as the Strong, left behind something a little more organic. Children, dozens of them, possibly over 100. Enough to fill a mid-size opera house or a particularly chaotic family reunion. But where most royals meticulously curated their heirs, Augustus produced offspring with such enthusiastic disregard for protocol that historians today can't even agree on the final count, let alone how many he actually acknowledged. Born in 1670, Augustus wasn't originally destined for the Polish throne. He was the Elector of Saxony, a wealthy and influential region of the Holy Roman Empire. But like many ambitious nobles of the era, he decided to upgrade, so he converted to Catholicism, a move that scandalized his Protestant court and successfully campaigned to become King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania in 1697. This required more than just political maneuvering. It required reinvention. Augustus became a man of contradictions. German Protestant turned Polish Catholic, military strongman turned art patron, lover of Enlightenment ideals turned monarch by divine right. But none of those contradictions were quite as colourful or as quietly destructive as his personal life. The name Augustus the Strong was not just metaphorical. Contemporary accounts describe him as physically powerful to the point of absurdity. He allegedly broke horseshoes with his bare hands, wrestled wild animals for sport, could crush silverware between his fingers. But his most enduring feat of strength was reproductive. He is believed to have fathered somewhere between 30 and 365 illegitimate children, a number so symbolic, one for every day of the year, that it has become folklore. Of course, not all of these children were acknowledged. That would have been logistically and politically impossible, even by 18th century standards. Some were given small pensions. Others were quietly married off to lesser nobility. Some were passed off as wards or godchildren. And a significant number were simply forgotten, their names lost to history, their status denied not by scandal, but by silence. Augustus had numerous mistresses, noblewomen, courtiers, opera singers, and anyone else unlucky enough to attract the king's notoriously roving eye. His most famous consort, Countess Anna Constantia of Cosel, bore him at least 3 children, only one of whom he ever officially recognized. Even in the most high-profile of these affairs, acknowledgement was selective, strategic, and temporary. One moment, a child might be paraded at court as a minor prince or princess. The next, their name might vanish from the official record, replaced by the polite fiction of illegitimacy, or worse, non-existence. This wasn't merely a matter of personal embarrassment. In a Europe where royal bloodlines determined not just inheritance but national alliances, the presence of unacknowledged royal children could, and often did, trigger succession crises, civil unrest, and diplomatic chaos. Augustus knew this. He just didn't seem to care, and so he created a private empire of half-royals, children born of privilege but denied position. Many of them were sent away, to convents, to obscure noble houses, or into arranged marriages designed to erase their origins. Others remained close to court, but were never formally claimed. Their lives were a constant balancing act, royal by birth, common by decree, and yet the myth of Augustus's virility became part of his political brand. While most monarchs tried to hide their illegitimate children, Augustus practically advertised them. His strength was seen not just in terms of military prowess or political cunning, but in his ability to father offspring at industrial scale. In the Baroque world of Saxon absolutism, masculinity and monarchy were fused into one symbolic package, one that often trampled the lives of the very people it created. Take, for example, Maurice de Saxe, perhaps the most famous of Augustus's illegitimate children. Born to a French actress, Maurice was one of the lucky few to be publicly acknowledged. He went on to become a celebrated military commander and Marshal of France. But for every Maurice, there were dozens, maybe hundreds, of children who received no name, no title, no path forward, just the quiet curse of royal blood diluted by anonymity. What makes Augustus's case so fascinating isn't just the scale of his romantic adventures, it's the systematic way in which the monarchy turned acknowledgement into strategy. Some children were elevated to bolster alliances, others were ignored to protect legitimacy, some were half-remembered in private letters, others were erased entirely. And as with all royal silences, the consequences didn't stop with the father. These unacknowledged sons and daughters lived out strange, fractured lives, too noble for the common world, too illegitimate for the royal one. They married downward, enlisted in foreign armies, changed their names, wrote memoirs, disappeared into monasteries. A few surfaced later in life with claims and lawsuits. Most simply faded. Even Augustus's death in 1733 did little to clarify things. His official line of succession passed through his legitimate son, Augustus III, but the kingdom he left behind was filled with loose threads, half-siblings, forgotten daughters, and the soft sound of unanswered questions. Because even in death, Augustus had managed to create something few monarchs ever do, an empire of ambiguity. But in the annals of English monarchy, ambiguity had always been part of the bloodline. And as the next story proves, sometimes even the most infamous kings, the ones who executed wives and dissolved churches, left behind more children than the official histories were willing to admit. And unlike Augustus, this king only publicly acknowledged one. But the whispers said there were more, always more. His name was Henri VIII, and his forgotten children are the ghost notes of an unfinished anthem. Henri VIII of England. When it comes to royal scandal, Henri VIII is less a king and more a genre. He's the monarch whose marital history reads like a cautionary fable, whose break from the Catholic Church reshaped Europe, and whose appetite for power, legacy, and personal control seemed to devour everything in its path. But while most history books obsess over his 6 wives and 3 legitimate heirs, a quieter question lingers beneath the executions and annulments. How many children did Henri VIII actually have? Officially, the number is 4. 1 legitimate son, Edward VI, 2 legitimate daughters, Mary I and Elizabeth I, and 1 acknowledged illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, Duke of Richmond and Somerset. That's the short version, the polite version, the version that fits nicely on a family tree. But history, especially Tudor history, is never that neat, especially not when it comes to Henry. Let's start with Fitzroy, because even he complicates things. Born in 1519 to Elizabeth Blount, a lady-in-waiting and Henry's mistress during his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, Fitzroy was not a dirty secret. In fact, he was almost the opposite. Henry not only acknowledged him, he lavished titles on him. By the age of 6, Fitzroy was a duke, and by the time he was a teenager, there were real whispers that he might be named Henry's successor, despite his illegitimacy. In the Tudor world, this was revolutionary. Kings didn't usually elevate their bastards this brazenly, but Henry was already breaking rules at every turn. Fitzroy died young at 17, before any formal succession plans could be enacted. But the gesture remained. Henry had proven he was willing to recognize illegitimate children when it suited him. So why only Fitzroy? Because Henry's children were not just children. They were proofs of concept. Each one had to serve a purpose: political, dynastic, theological. And if they didn't, they were erased. That brings us to the countless rumours, reports and footnotes in letters and chronicles hinting that Fitzroy was not Henry's only child born outside marriage. The 16th century was a leaky sieve when it came to royal gossip. Names like Thomas Stukely, John Perrott and even Ethelreda Malty pop up in historical fragments, each linked, often loosely, to claims of royal paternity. None of them were officially acknowledged. All of them lived lives marked by strange privilege and stranger rumour. Thomas Stukely, for instance, was a soldier and adventurer who claimed loudly and often that he was Henry VIII's son. He carried himself with the swagger of someone who believed it, if nothing else. Even Elizabeth I reportedly referred to him as the king's son, though whether that was sarcastic or sincere is still debated. Stukely certainly acted like royalty, leading wild escapades across Europe, eventually dying in Morocco while trying to conquer kingdoms on a whim. Classic Tudor behaviour, in other words. Then there's Sir John Perrot, a courtier and Lord Deputy of Ireland. He was noted, sometimes alarmingly so, for his physical resemblance to Henry VIII. Broad-shouldered, red-haired, temperamental, and fond of making decisions with his fists. One contemporary observer wrote that in manner and face he is the very image of our late sovereign. His enemies whispered he was a bastard son. His friends didn't deny it too loudly. Henry never acknowledged him, of course, but once again, the absence of recognition doesn't equal absence of connection. Perhaps most interesting of all is Ethelreda Malte, a woman whose name doesn't appear in many royal chronicles, but who was granted land and money far beyond what one would expect for the daughter of a tailor's wife. Her mother, Joan Dingley, had been in the royal household. Her guardian was a royal servant, and her quiet patronage followed a suspiciously royal pattern, discreet, consistent, and impossible to explain through conventional means. Why were these children, if they were indeed his, never acknowledged like Fitzroy? The answer, as with all Tudor questions, is political calculus. Fitzroy was born during Henry's long frustration with Catherine of Aragon's inability to provide a male heir. Acknowledging a son, even a bastard, was a way of asserting his virility and sending a message to Rome and to his court. It's not me. I can produce a male heir. The problem, therefore, must lie elsewhere. But once the Reformation began and Henry started redefining not just marriage but monarchy itself, the rules changed. Children born outside of his ever-shifting marital legitimacy became legal and theological landmines. Acknowledging them could undermine his other children's claims. It could suggest that he didn't believe in the sanctity of his own marriages, or worse, it could hint that the line of succession might stretch further than anyone had been told. So he did what monarchs do best. He chose silence, strategic, cold, and absolute. What happened to those maybe children? Most were folded into the nobility, given modest positions, or simply ignored. Some died young, some lived long, complicated lives haunted by a name they could never use. And a few clung to the idea that they were born of kings, even if the king never said so. In the end, Henry VIII didn't just leave behind a fractured church and a trail of decapitated marriages. He left behind questions, familial, national, existential. And perhaps that's the most Tudor thing of all, to define legacy not through certainty, but through the power of a maybe. And while England was consumed by succession crises and shifting allegiances across the sea in a neighbouring kingdom, another monarch quietly engaged in similar behaviour, leaving behind children and claims, some acknowledged, some quietly ignored. His name was Edward IV of England, and his family tree was about to become one of the most contested in British history. Edward IV of England. In the great soap opera that is British royal history, few plotlines have aged quite like the Wars of the Roses, a dynastic conflict that lasted decades and left a nation drenched not just in blood, but in paperwork. At the centre of it all stood Edward IV, the first Yorkist king of England, towering at over 6 feet tall, a veritable giant for the 15th century. He looked like a king, fought like a king, and ruled like one, at least when he wasn't busy building a reputation for strategic romantic entanglements and peculiarly timed royal silences. Edward IV's official story is reasonably well known. He seized the crown in 1461, lost it briefly, and reclaimed it with dramatic flair. He married Elizabeth Woodville, a commoner and widow, in what was either a love match or a political wildcard, depending on which historian you ask. Together, they had 10 children, including the ill-fated Edward V and Elizabeth of York, the latter of whom would become the mother of Henry VIII. But as with any monarch of that era, there was the story that appeared on the family crest, and the one that hovered behind it, because Edward, like many kings before and after him, had a private life that bled inconveniently into his public one. His court was known for its indulgence. He was charming, affable, and, according to contemporary accounts, rather susceptible to beauty and flattery, particularly when it came in the form of young noblewomen and ambitious widows. And from those encounters, inevitably, came children. Some acknowledged, others not so much. At least one of Edward's illegitimate sons is widely accepted by historians, Arthur Plantagenet, who would go on to serve under Henry VIII as Viscount Lisle. Born around 1461 to an unidentified mistress, possibly Elizabeth Lucy, possibly someone else entirely, Arthur was given a place at court, a title, and the kind of quiet respect reserved for royal byproducts who behaved themselves. He was a classic Tudor compromise, not in line for the throne, but not cast out either. Useful, loyal, slightly blurred at the edges. He never claimed more than he was given, which made him ideal. But Arthur's existence wasn't scandalous because of what he did. It was scandalous because of what it implied. That Edward IV, the king whose legitimacy was constantly under threat, was producing heirs outside of marriage at the very same time he was trying to cement a dynasty. And here lies the core contradiction. Edward IV fought his way to the throne based on claims of legitimate inheritance, and then spent his reign quietly diluting that concept. His marriage to Elizabeth Woodville angered nobles who expected him to forge more strategic alliances. His in-laws gained power, sparking resentment and court intrigue, and meanwhile, his rumoured illegitimate children kept popping up in the footnotes of noble genealogies. One particularly persistent rumour involves Elizabeth Shaw, one of Edward's most famous mistresses, so famous in fact that she was later portrayed in Shakespeare's Richard III as a kind of femme fatale. Whether she bore the king any children is still debated. Some sources hint at a child raised outside the court, others suggest it was simply slander invented by political enemies, but the rumour never quite died, because Edward's reputation gave it oxygen. Then there's the shadowy case of Grace Plantagenet, a woman thought to be an illegitimate daughter of Edward IV. She appears in a few surviving records, most notably during the funeral of her stepmother, Queen Elizabeth Woodville, where she is listed as a mourner. Why would a woman with no formal title or clear parentage be given such a role at a royal funeral unless she was part of the family? Like many women of the era, her story fades into the administrative silence of royal paperwork. No titles, no inheritance, no open acknowledgement, but presence nonetheless, and presence is its own kind of proof. The irony, of course, is that Edward IV's own legitimacy was called into question after his death. In the infamous Titulus Regius, his brother Richard III declared that Edward's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid due to a pre-contract with another woman, rendering all their children illegitimate. It was a power move, certainly, but one that relied on a grim royal symmetry. A man who had fathered children in the shadows was now accused of never having had a legitimate marriage at all. And so Edward's entire lineage, including the princes in the Tower, was briefly deemed invalid by the very system he had spent his life manipulating. His legacy became a hall of mirrors, a legitimate king with illegitimate children, whose legitimate heirs were labelled illegitimate, while his illegitimate children lived quietly in semi-royal limbo. It's a dynastic logic puzzle only the Tudors could solve. And they did in their own way, by rewriting history, destroying documents, and marrying Edward's daughter Elizabeth to Henri VII to stitch together a wounded crown. But what of those other children? The ones who didn't make it into the royal histories? They existed in a kind of narrative negative space, never fully erased but never fully written in. Their names don't appear in succession charts. Their faces don't show up in court portraits, but their blood runs through the veins of countless English noble families, passed down like heirlooms no one will claim. And while England was busy debating who had the stronger claim to the throne, in the misty highlands of Scotland, another royal family was dealing with a similar pattern. Kings with legitimate heirs and illegitimate children, some whispered about, some kept just close enough to use. One of them was known as William the Lion, a king whose roar was felt far less loudly than his reputation would suggest, especially when it came to the children history politely forgot. William the Lion of Scotland. If you were to list the most fearsome royal nicknames in history, William the Lion might sound like a contender. a title evoking roaring armies, blood-streaked banners, and thunderous horseback charges through medieval fog. But the truth, as always with royalty, is layered with contradiction. William I of Scotland, known as William mac Éanric to his contemporaries, ruled from 1165 to 1214, a reign of nearly 50 years, one of the longest in Scottish history. And while he may have roared occasionally on the battlefield, his political life was more often spent negotiating humiliating treaties, collecting taxes, and, perhaps most notably, fathering children whose names rarely made it onto the official scrolls. Officially, William had one legitimate heir, Alexander II, born to his queen, Ermengarde de Beaumont. But unofficially, that's where things get murky. Contemporary sources list at least 6 illegitimate children attributed to William, though historians believe the actual number could be significantly higher. These children were scattered across the kingdom. Some were married off strategically to low-ranking nobles, others entered religious life, and a few were handed lands or positions that hinted ever so gently at their royal paternity without saying it outright. In other words, William practiced the age-old art of semi-acknowledgement, the medieval version of a royal footnote. Let's begin with the names we do have. Among William's illegitimate children were Robert de London Isabella, or Isabel, of Scotland, Margaret of Scotland, Ada of Scotland, Orfrica de Scotlandia, Henry of Stirling. These names appear in charters, witness lists, and ecclesiastical records, always adjacent to the crown, but never at the centre. And that's the pattern. These children lived near power, but not in it. They were royal enough to be useful, but not legitimate enough to be dangerous. Take Robert de London, for instance. His surname is telling. De London, a rare designation in a Scottish royal context, likely signifying either the location of his birth or a deliberate attempt to distance him, nominally, from the Scottish court. Robert was granted lands and likely served in some military capacity, but he was not given titles, nor did he play any formal role in succession. He was the kind of child a king could use, and then politely forget. Then there's Isabella of Scotland, who married Robert de Ross, an English baron of some influence. This marriage suggests a level of acknowledgement. Royal daughters, legitimate or not, didn't typically get married off without their fathers say-so. Yet Isabella was never referred to as princess, and the marriage contract contains none of the overt royal fanfare that would accompany the union of a fully recognized daughter of the king. And then there's Ada, who married Malcolm, Earl of Athol, another alliance that quietly served the crown without ever acknowledging her as fully royal. These marriages helped solidify alliances with key noble families while keeping the royal brand unsullied by inconvenient genealogical complexity. But for every Ada or Isabella, there were likely others. Children whose names are lost, who never appeared in charters, who were raised by mothers whose identities were themselves conveniently omitted from history. In medieval royal courts, the line between mistress and political liability was razor-thin. Kings were expected to indulge, but not to elevate, to acknowledge just enough to prevent scandal, but never enough to invite complication. William the Lion, despite his epithet, governed more like a bureaucrat than a warlord. After a disastrous military campaign against the English early in his reign, which ended with his capture at the Battle of Alnwick in 1174, he was forced to sign the Treaty of Falaise, rendering Scotland a vassal of the English crown for years. It was a national humiliation, and one that likely made William especially cautious about succession and legitimacy. He couldn't afford a crisis, not another one. So while his court may have hummed with whispers of royal bastards, none of them were ever positioned to threaten the throne. When William finally married Ermengarde in 1186, after 2 decades on the throne, the pressure to produce a legitimate heir was immense. It's possible that the presence of so many illegitimate children made this even more urgent. The contrast between acknowledged and unacknowledged would need to be stark. There could be no ambiguity. Alexander II, born in 1198, was that answer. Heir, son, the only one who mattered officially, and from that point forward, William's illegitimate children, those born before his marriage, began to fade further into the margins. They were used where they were useful, married where they were needed, and erased where they were inconvenient. The irony, of course, is that William's dynasty would not last long. His son Alexander died without legitimate heirs of his own, and Scotland would soon spiral into succession crises and English invasions, problems that a few more legitimate offspring might have helped avoid. But William had drawn his lines early and firmly. Royalty was not to be diluted, even if it meant ignoring half of his bloodline. In the end, William the Lion's legacy was built less on roars and more on quiet redactions. A long reign, carefully curated, with just enough acknowledgement to keep the court in line, and just enough omission to leave us wondering how many royal children truly walked the forests and halls of medieval Scotland, bearing royal features and forgotten names. And speaking of forgotten names, William wasn't the only Scottish king who played that game. One of his successors, Robert II, would take the art of royal reproduction to new administrative heights, fathering so many children, legitimate and otherwise, that his descendants would populate Scotland's nobility for centuries, not all of them with his blessing and not all of them with his name. Robert II of Scotland. In the long and weathered tapestry of Scottish kings, Robert II is often remembered not for war, reform, or any dramatic moment of sovereign power, but for something far more biologically persistent: his ability to produce heirs at a rate that would impress even a spreadsheet. He was the first monarch of the House of Stuart, ascending to the throne in 1371, and if there was one thing he took seriously about founding a dynasty, it was the dynasty part. By the time Robert died in 1390, Scotland was thick with his descendants, some legitimate, many not. His legacy was a genealogist's fever dream and a historian's logistical nightmare. A kingdom ruled by a king whose seed seemed to ignore all known laws of moderation. Officially, Robert had 10 legitimate children with his first wife, Elizabeth Muir, and another 4 with his second, Euphemia de Ross. 14 children, all of them with titles, lands, and ambitions. That alone would have been enough to scatter the royal bloodline across the Highlands like thistle seeds. But those were just the ones with paperwork. Robert's extramarital affairs, or more politely, informal unions, added another layer to the story. There are numerous accounts of additional children born outside his marriages, some of them noted in legal records, others buried in the tangled thickets of oral tradition, monastic chronicles, and disputed family trees. Some were given small titles or land grants, others faded into noble lineages without explanation, and some simply disappeared, their existence left unconfirmed but heavily implied. This wasn't entirely unusual for the time. Royal courts operated on a strange continuum between public legitimacy and private acceptance. A king might not formally recognize a child, but if that child married well, was useful in a political alliance, or simply resembled the monarch a little too much, exceptions were made. Doors were quietly opened, documents discreetly stamped, but in Robert's case, the volume of children and the overlap between the official and unofficial ones blurred the line between family and faction. Take the case of Alexander Stuart, known later as the Wolf of Badenoch. He was a legitimate son, yes, but his own behavior, which included burning down Elgin Cathedral during a feud, suggested a family raised more on autonomy than accountability. Then there were the lesser-known Stewarts, scattered across Scotland, many of them bearing royal names and minor titles, but with origins that trace back to vague maternal figures and land grants that appear out of nowhere. The term royal bastard was practically a social category in late 14th century Scotland. This pattern wasn't just a result of Robert's personal choices, it was also structural. The early Stuart kings weren't operating under the rigid dynastic protocols of later monarchies. Scotland in the 14th century was a patchwork of feuding, clans, loose allegiances, and ever-shifting borders. Royal blood, even when diluted or unofficial, could be used as a tool of stabilization. Giving a child a noble marriage or a command post wasn't just a favor, it was an investment in political loyalty. But this came at a cost. Robert's strategy of saturation, filling the kingdom with his children and grandchildren, planted the seeds for generations of internal conflict. The nobility became a game of Stuart musical chairs. Every major noble house eventually claimed descent from Robert II, legitimate or otherwise, and that made every succession dispute personal. By the time of the 15th century civil wars, it was nearly impossible to find a Scottish noble who didn't, in some remote way, claim kinship with the throne. Half the kingdom had royal blood, and the other half was married to someone who did. And yet, for all this dynastic density, Robert II himself remained a curiously low-profile figure. Unlike his grandson, James I, who was murdered in a sewer tunnel, or his great-grandson, James III, who was killed by rebellious nobles, Robert II died quietly in his bed, having lived long enough to see many of his children and grandchildren rise to power. But that doesn't mean the story was neat, because many of his children were never fully acknowledged, at least not in the sense of formal succession or court prominence. They existed in the grey zone, recognized when politically useful, ignored when not. Some were pushed into the church, others were married off to lesser families, their royal origins implied but never advertised. A few were left to create minor noble lines that would, centuries later, boast of their royal roots like a family secret everyone already knew. What Robert II established wasn't just a royal family, it was a royal ecosystem, one in which bloodlines flowed in every direction, diluting the very notion of royal exclusivity. And though he likely never imagined it, this sprawling legacy would come to haunt future monarchs, as claims to the throne became tangled in a web of partial acknowledgements, forgotten lineages, and too many Stuarts with too few surnames. The Stuart dynasty didn't just dominate Scottish history, it saturated it. But Robert II wasn't the only medieval monarch to mix piety with pragmatism or passion with denial. While he was busy quietly populating Scotland with unofficial heirs, another king across the border was doing the same, with just as much secrecy and just as little regret. Henri II of England was a man of ambition, law, and empire, and behind his castles and conquests, he left a legacy of royal children, not just the famous ones, but the forgotten ones, the ones he didn't crown but couldn't quite ignore. Henri II of England. In the medieval royal lineage, Henri II of England was less a monarch and more a force of nature. Founder of the Plantagenet dynasty, ruler of a vast empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, and a man who spent more time riding horses than sitting on thrones, Henry was a king who saw everything in terms of territory, land, power, loyalty, and people, including his own children. He is most famously remembered as the father of Richard the Lionheart and King John, two sons whose personalities were so different they feel like opposites invented by a novelist. But Henry's genetic legacy didn't begin or end with his legitimate children, because behind the political machinations, treaties, and endless wars, Henry II left behind a trail of illegitimate offspring, scattered across his empire like royal breadcrumbs. Some he acknowledged, others were ignored, bypassed, or quietly disposed of. Politically, that is. And therein lies the mystery. For a king obsessed with order and control, Henry's private life was wildly ungoverned. His queen, Eleanor of Aquitaine, was one of the most formidable women in European history. Their marriage was, by all accounts, strategic, tempestuous, and frequently interrupted by affairs. His, mainly. Henry had at least a dozen illegitimate children by multiple mistresses. Some of their names are known: Geoffrey, William, Morgan, Matilda, Alice, and Osbert Giffard, among others. And while these children were not in line for the throne, they were not without use. Henry understood that illegitimate children could serve as pawns on the chessboard of empire, but only if they were handled carefully. Take Geoffrey, perhaps the most prominent of Henry's bastards. Born before his marriage to Eleanor, Geoffrey was made Archbishop of York, a prestigious post, if one that conveniently removed him from any potential military ambitions. The church was a convenient destination for inconvenient sons, spiritual enough to appear honourable, political enough to remain useful. But Geoffrey didn't go quietly. His relationship with his half-brothers was fraught with suspicion, particularly with King John, who would later attempt to imprison him during a church service, proving that no blood, legitimate or not, was thicker than royal paranoia. Then there's William Longspay, another of Henry's illegitimate sons, who became Earl of Salisbury. Unlike Geoffrey, William was raised to wield a sword rather than a crozier. He married well, fought well, and became a loyal servant to the crown under Richard and John. His elevation to the nobility was a rare case of royal recognition resulting in genuine power. But even William's status was a double-edged sword. He was noble, but never fully royal. His name meant everything and nothing. In court, he was a Plantagenet. In law, he was a footnote. Most of Henry's illegitimate daughters were married off to minor nobles. These marriages were strategic peace offerings designed to secure loyalty or silence. One such daughter, Matilda, was married to Rotrou IV, Count of Perche. Another, Alice, is thought to have been raised at court and then slipped into history through one of the countless alliances that blurred royal and noble blood. But not every child was acknowledged, and this is where Henry's calculated approach begins to unravel. Several chroniclers mention other potential children whose names are lost or disputed, children born to courtesans, foreign noblewomen, or unnamed mistresses who may have been silenced or sidelined to avoid political complication. These children, if they existed, were erased not with malice, but with bureaucracy. They were never written into law, so they were never real, and that erasure was deliberate. Henry II ruled not only through war, but through record-keeping. He reformed the English legal system, standardized financial administration, and developed the royal exchequer into a tool of total control. This was a man who wanted systems, accountability, and clear lines of succession. Illegitimate children posed a threat to that clarity, so he used them when convenient and disappeared them when not. But even when he disappeared them, he couldn't quite make them go away, because they existed, not just as people, but as rumors, as complications, as shadows cast across the more official narratives of his dynasty. And those shadows grew longer as his legitimate sons began to tear each other and the kingdom apart. Richard, the Golden Crusader; John, the conniving failure; Henry, the young king who rebelled and died young; Geoffrey, Duke of Brittany, who died before his time, but left behind a son, Arthur, who would become a cause for succession crisis and eventual murder. In that tangled web of heirs and claimants, the idea of more children, hidden or forgotten, became dangerous. In royal politics, every sibling, acknowledged or not, was a possible threat. And yet, despite the looming chaos, Henry continued on as if order could be imposed by sheer force of will. His court, his church appointments, his noble marriages, all of it was an attempt to bind people to him, to stabilize a monarchy that was always just one rebellion away from collapse. He died in 1189, betrayed by his sons, exhausted by war, and likely aware that his carefully constructed legacy would not survive intact. But even then, the rumors remained that there were more children, that some had escaped the record, that his blood ran in veins that would never sit on the throne, but would always remember who their father was, even if he never admitted it. And across the Channel, as England grieved and reorganized itself, a similar drama was playing out, because Henry's own son, the future King John, would go on to father his own children, both legitimate and not. And like his father, he would face the same question every monarch tries to avoid. How do you rule a kingdom when pieces of your legacy are walking around unacknowledged, unclaimed, and potentially dangerous? King John of England. If Henry II was the architect of a vast royal enterprise, his youngest son, King John, was the contractor who showed up late, dropped the plans in a puddle, and then tried to sue the mud. History has not been kind to John. Even Shakespeare seemed personally offended by him. He's remembered as the villain of the Robin Hood legends, the tyrant forced to sign the Magna Carta, and the Plantagenet who lost more land than any English monarch before him. But hidden behind the military defeats and baronial betrayals is a quieter, stickier subplot, one involving illegitimate children, political pawns, and a legacy of denial that never quite vanished. John was married twice, first briefly to Isabel of Gloucester, a union annulled for consanguinity, royal shorthand for "we're a little too," related even by medieval standards. Then to Isabella of Angoulême, a 12-year-old French heiress whose marriage to John triggered a chain of continental wars and diplomatic collapse. With Isabella, he had 5 legitimate children, including the future Henry III. But predictably, John's procreative energy was not confined to the boundaries of matrimony. Contemporary chroniclers agree that John had numerous illegitimate children, though the exact number remains elusive. Names appear in charters and letters, often with vague titles like "Our Beloved Kinsman" or "The King's Son." Some of these children were openly acknowledged. Richard Fitzroy, for instance, who fought in military campaigns and was granted the lordship of Chilham in Kent. Others were less fortunate, known in record but unclaimed in life, granted minor positions, then shuffled quietly off the stage when politics demanded it. John's use of illegitimate offspring was calculated. He granted them lands, arranged marriages, appointed them to strategic roles, not because he loved them, he didn't seem to love anyone, but because they were tools. In a kingdom increasingly defined by rebellion and fragility, loyalty was everything, and loyalty could be purchased through blood, even the unofficial kind. That said, John didn't treat his illegitimate children uniformly. Some were lavished with wealth and protection. Others were handed over to monastic institutions or local lords, their existence acknowledged only by implication. The difference often came down to political expediency. If a bastard child could be married into a family of strategic value, great. If not, they might as well be furniture, present but never discussed. What makes John's paternal record particularly tangled is the contrast between his need for control and his failure to manage even the most basic optics of royal family life. He was paranoid, secretive, and vindictive, and yet his court was full of whispers, half-hidden relatives, and unofficial heirs lurking in the margins. He created the very instability he feared. And as his reign crumbled, through military losses in France, revolts at home, and the eventual signing of Magna Carta in 1215, these unacknowledged children became part of the background tension. Were they harmless? Were they plotting? Were they just one noble marriage away from becoming a problem? Historians suspect that at least a dozen illegitimate children can be attributed to John, but the list is as unstable as his temper. Some disappeared from records entirely. Others pop up decades later with titles and estates that can only be explained by a royal connection. And in the end, the real legacy of these children was not their blood, but the culture of ambiguity they reinforced. A royal family that operated like a closed club, with selective membership and secret bylaws. John died in 1216, exhausted, unpopular, and buried beneath a cathedral that seemed more relieved than reverent. His legitimate son, Henry III, would reign for over 50 years. But even during that long reign, the illegitimate branches of John's family tree continued to grow, unofficial, often unacknowledged, but always there. Because for kings like John, the real fear wasn't rebellion, it was recognition. To acknowledge these children was to admit vulnerability. To leave them unacknowledged was to risk instability. Either way, the crown never quite escaped the consequences. And if John's reign was built on shaky foundations, his predecessor and rival, King Stephen of England, had laid the blueprints. Because Stephen too had children outside marriage, and unlike John, he couldn't even hide behind competence. He ruled during a time so chaotic they named it the anarchy, which is almost poetic, considering how few people could even agree on who belonged to the royal family during his reign. King Stephen of England. In the pantheon of English monarchs, King Stephen is less a hero or villain than a glitch in the succession system. His reign, from 1135 to 1154, is best remembered not for what he did, but for what he failed to prevent. England, under his rule, descended into a 2-decade civil war so disorganized and chaotic that chroniclers simply called it the anarchy. And rightly so. There were two rival claimants to the throne, armies switching sides mid-battle, and entire regions governed by whichever noble happened to own the sharpest sword that week. In this maelstrom of broken oaths and collapsing institutions, it's easy to forget that Stephen was not a placeholder. He was a king, a man, a royal with a private life, a wife, legitimate children, and like so many of his peers, a few children that history quietly shuffled into the unacknowledged pile. Stephen's legitimate marriage to Matilda of Boulogne produced 4 children: Eustace, William, Baldwin, and Mary. Eustace was groomed for kingship, but died young. William was passed over for the throne in favour of Henri II as part of a peace settlement that effectively ended Stephen's claim to anything but retirement. The others vanished into ecclesiastical roles and dynastic footnotes. But what about Stephen's illegitimate children? Here's where things get foggy. Unlike his cousin and rival, Empress Matilda, whose lineage was stamped on parchment with imperial authority, Stephen's family history is a mix of mild scandal and mild amnesia. Contemporary sources suggest he had at least 2 illegitimate children, though the details are maddeningly vague. A woman named Gervaise of Blois, sometimes rendered as a man, sometimes as a cleric, appears in some records as being connected to Stephen, possibly a son who entered the church. Others point to children born before his marriage, but the names and fates are lost to the vacuum of 12th century record keeping. This silence is telling. Stephen's entire reign was marked by a desperate need to appear legitimate. He had taken the throne after swearing fealty to Empress Matilda, only to crown himself anyway. His rule was contested from day one. Every act he made was about shoring up authority, building castles, forging alliances, bribing barons. The last thing he needed was a trail of unofficial children to further dilute the already questionable purity of his claim. So instead, he buried them, not literally, but historically. Any bastards born before his marriage were quietly omitted from succession discussions. Any born afterward were treated as non-entities. They weren't useful to his fragile throne, so they were edited out of his legacy. And yet, the rumour remains that during one of the most unstable reigns in English history, Stephen may have had sons and daughters whose bloodline was royal, but whose existence was politically inconvenient. These children, if they lived, would have grown up in a kingdom constantly shifting beneath their feet, unnamed in court, unrecognised by the church, and unwanted in the line of succession. They were ghosts before they were gone. Stephen died in 1154, his reign ending with a treaty that gave the crown to the very dynasty he had tried to prevent from taking power. The Plantagenets swept in, bringing order, or at least a new kind of chaos. His legitimate children were sidelined. His illegitimate ones, if they existed, were never mentioned again. But the pattern had been set. Royal illegitimacy had its uses. it had its risks, and in the case of Stephen, it had its silences. Long calculated silences that echo through the royal histories with a kind of quiet finality. And in the next chapter of that silence, another king who wore the Scottish crown, a warrior legend, a national hero, and inevitably a father to more than just the heirs you read about in school. His name was Robert the Bruce, and his family tree has far more branches than most care to count. Robert the Bruce, few names in Scottish history resonate with the same weight as Robert the Bruce. He was the rebel king, the warrior monarch who fought the English at Bannockburn, the national symbol of independence long before Braveheart-era mythologizing muddied the historical waters. But behind the banners, the battlefield glory, and the solemn stone effigies lies the quieter truth of medieval kingship. The business of legacy didn't stop at borders. It extended into bedrooms, bloodlines, and the blurred politics of acknowledged versus unacknowledged children. Robert the Bruce officially reigned as King of Scots from 1306 until his death in 1329. His was a reign hard-earned and blood-soaked, marked by guerrilla warfare, papal excommunication, and eventual diplomatic legitimacy. He married twice. His first wife, Isabella of Mar, died young but gave him a daughter, Marjorie Bruce, who would become the grandmother of Robert II, the very founder of the Stuart dynasty. His second wife, Elizabeth de Burgh, bore him 4 more children, including his only legitimate son and successor, David II. But the full roster of Robert's offspring does not end there. Several other children were born to him outside of marriage, and while some were acknowledged, others have been lost to historical vagueness. Their stories, like so many born into royal ambiguity, unfold in the margins of charters, land grants, and battle records hinted at, never formally crowned by history. One of the most well-documented of these children is Sir Robert Bruce of Liddesdale, an illegitimate son, though not entirely illegitimate in function. He was granted lands and royal favour and is believed to have fought alongside his father in Scotland's wars for independence. But his status remained that of a natural son, which meant his name could be used politically when it served the crown and forgotten when it did not. Then there's Neil of Carrick, another likely illegitimate son whose exact parentage is debated, but whose presence in the historical record suggests a close connection to Robert the Bruce's royal household. Again, he served militarily. Again, he had lands. Again, he lacked full acknowledgement in the formal succession. The political logic was clear. Scotland needed unity, not dynastic complexity. In the aftermath of war and English occupation, Robert the Bruce's legitimacy as king had to be reinforced, not muddied with additional claimants. His enemies had already spent years trying to brand him a usurper, a murderer, especially in relation to the killing of John Comyn, and a king by violence rather than divine right. The last thing he could afford was to elevate bastards into prominence, only to have them become tools of his rivals later on. And yet, these children existed, in castles, on horseback, in the swirl of courtly obligations and military campaigns. They bore the Bruce name, they bore his features, they bore in some cases his quiet patronage, but what they did not bear was the royal weight of acknowledgement. That space was reserved for David II, the fragile child of a politically sanctioned marriage, whose reign would eventually crumble under the pressures of captivity, weak leadership, and dynastic uncertainty. Ironically, David produced no children, legitimate or otherwise, which means that Robert the Bruce's acknowledged male line ended with a whisper. The future kings of Scotland descended not from David, but from Marjorie Bruce, Robert's daughter from his first marriage, the mother of Robert II, which means that the royal line survived not through the male heir, but through the side branch, a side branch born of a daughter born of a brief, politically limited marriage, while the sons he may have trusted in battle, the ones who may have walked beside him through the darkest days of the Scottish Wars of Independence, were quietly folded into the background, their legacy unrecorded except in noble bloodlines that would resurface generations later, often carrying names but not crowns. Robert the Bruce was, above all else, a political strategist. His survival and his kingship depended on maintaining clarity, control, and symbolic legitimacy in a kingdom constantly on the edge of disintegration. Recognizing too many children could dilute the crown's authority, leaving them unacknowledged. That preserved the fiction of a singular, divinely sanctioned dynasty. But like all fictions, this one left behind ghosts, not haunting castles, but haunting documents, land records, and the unspoken threads of blood that bind Scotland's nobility together more tightly than anyone dares to admit. And as we turn the page to another Scottish king, we find one who followed a similar path, a monarch who ruled in the wake of rebellion, who bore children both within and outside of marriage, and whose family tree is pruned, polished, and selectively remembered. His name was Alexander II of Scotland, and his illegitimate legacy may be smaller than Robert the Bruce's, but no less mysterious. Alexander II of Scotland. When Alexander II came to the Scottish throne in 1214, he was just 16 years old, young enough to inspire hope, old enough to lead armies. His reign was framed by the still smoking aftermath of his father's conflicts with the English crown and the political tension that marked the northern kingdoms for centuries. Compared to other Scottish monarchs, Alexander's time on the throne is often described as one of relative stability. But royal peace is often a well-arranged illusion, maintained not just by diplomacy, but by decisions made in private and buried in silence. And like so many of his predecessors and successors, Alexander II fathered at least one child outside the royal marriage bed. Officially, Alexander married twice. His first wife, Joan of England, daughter of King John, brought with her the ever-complicated baggage of Anglo-Scottish relations. Their union produced no children. His second marriage to Marie de Coucy finally secured a legitimate heir, Alexander III, a boy whose future would be filled with political pressure, national hopes, and ultimately tragedy. But tucked between these diplomatic unions lies a name, or rather a whisper of one. Marjorie, sometimes recorded as a daughter of Alexander II by an unnamed woman. Not much is known about her, but enough survives in fragments to suggest she married Alan Durwood, a powerful nobleman and justiciar of Scotland. The marriage was not lowly, it was strategic, and that's the clue. Marjorie may have been born outside of marriage, but she was not treated like an accident. She was placed, gifted into the hands of a man who could be trusted with a semi-royal alliance. Her name does not appear in succession rolls. She was never styled as princess, but her marriage tells its own story. This was a daughter acknowledged in private, legitimized in practice, if not in law. That move, marrying off an illegitimate daughter to a key political figure, was part of a broader pattern among medieval monarchs. While sons outside of marriage posed a potential dynastic threat, daughters could be used to strengthen alliances. They carried royal blood without raising succession disputes. Their utility lay in their silence. And Alexander II was a king who valued silence. His reign, though filled with skirmishes, rebellions, and the occasional English invasion, was remarkable for its emphasis on internal consolidation. He sought to secure Scotland's western borders, assert dominance over the lords of Argyll, and stabilise the crown through legal reforms. Publicly, he was the architect of order. Privately, he made decisions that preserved that order, even if it meant rewriting or erasing certain aspects of his personal life. There may have been other children. There are hints. Gaps, land transfers that suggest royal intervention, minor figures in Scottish nobility who seem to rise a little too fast, marry a little too well, or receive just enough favour to raise eyebrows but not questions. If these children existed, their stories were intentionally obscured. They were useful only as long as they didn't interrupt the narrative. Alexander II died in 1249 while campaigning in the Hebrides, still trying to enforce Scottish claims over the Western Isles. His legitimate heir, Alexander III, was just 7 years old, and once again, the kingdom would face a period of regency, political maneuvering, and delicate dynastic chess. But the other children, the unspoken ones, vanished with him. They left no claim, no crisis, no recorded rebellion, only silence, the kind of silence that kings cultivate like hedges, pruned, shaped, and carefully maintained. And next in this lineage of quiet royal erasure comes James II of England and the VII of Scotland, a monarch born centuries later whose reign would end in exile, whose legacy would be rewritten by revolutions, and who would leave behind a trail of acknowledged, denied, and debated children, each more politically dangerous than the last. James II of England and the VII of Scotland. If ever a monarch was defined by the contradictions of legacy and denial, it was James II of England and the VII of Scotland. To some, he was the last legitimate king of the House of Stuart. To others, he was the tyrant who tried to force Catholicism on a Protestant nation. But history rarely deals in absolutes, especially not when it comes to royal paternity. And James, as it turns out, was as complex in his personal life as he was in his politics. Officially, James had many children. He married twice, first to Anne Hyde, the daughter of Edward Hyde, Earl of Clarendon, and second to Mary of Modena, an Italian Catholic princess whose very presence helped catalyze the Glorious Revolution. From Anne Hyde came two future queens, Mary II and Anne, both of whom would go on to rule after their father's exile. From Mary of Modena came James Francis Edward Stuart, the so-called Old Pretender, whose disputed birth would shake the British monarchy to its foundation. But before he was king, and before he was even married, James had other children, illegitimate children. Children born in the shadows of Restoration court life, fathered while James was still Duke of York and living in the long shadow of his older brother, Charles II. The irony, of course, is that Charles openly acknowledged dozens of his illegitimate children. James, on the other hand, was more selective, more discreet, and more politically aware of the risks involved. Among his better-known illegitimate children is James Fitzjames, later made Duke of Berwick. Born in 1670 to Arabella Churchill, sister of the future Duke of Marlborough, Fitzjames was not only acknowledged by James but elevated, groomed and strategically placed within European politics. He would go on to have a distinguished military career in France and Spain, and his descendants would hold noble titles across the continent. And yet, the very existence of James Fitzjames was something of a problem, not during James's youth, but during his reign. When James ascended the throne in 1685, England was already uneasy about his Catholicism. The last thing he needed was a trail of children, legitimate or otherwise, with ambiguous claims to royal blood. So Fitzjames was pushed outward, given a career abroad, and distanced from domestic succession conversations. This was a familiar tactic. Several other children attributed to James, whose mothers ranged from court attendants to minor nobility, were treated in similar fashion, quietly acknowledged in private, subtly benefited in practice, but never formally introduced to the public as royal progeny. They were too legitimate to fully discard, too illegitimate to fully embrace. And then came the real dynastic crisis, the birth of James Francis Edward Stuart in 1688 to Mary of Modena. The timing was, as always, inconvenient. James was already deeply unpopular, and the birth of a Catholic male heir, one who would displace his two Protestant daughters from the line of succession, ignited suspicion. The rumours were absurd and theatrical, that the child was stillborn, that he had been secretly switched with a living baby, smuggled into the Queen's chamber in a warming pan. that James II, so desperate for a Catholic heir, had staged the entire thing. These conspiracy theories spread like fire, and while most modern historians agree the baby was indeed his, the political fallout was irreversible. The Glorious Revolution followed soon after. William of Orange and Mary II deposed James, who fled to France, beginning the long exile of the Stuart line. From abroad, James would continue to support Jacobite uprisings, promoting his son's claim to the throne. But back home, the name Stuart began to take on an air of sedition. And what of the other children? Those born before the Revolution, outside of marriage, outside of ceremony? They were forgotten. Not denied exactly, but left behind. Fitzjames and others were folded into continental nobility. Some married well, others entered military service. None returned to challenge the new Protestant monarchy, not seriously. Their absence was their acknowledgement. They understood that to be a Stuart child was now a liability, not a privilege. James II died in exile in 1701, a king who never stopped believing he had been wronged by Parliament, by history, and perhaps by his own children. Because the ultimate irony of James's legacy is this: he was a man obsessed with dynastic continuity, but his most enduring legacy may be the uncertainty he left behind. Questions of legitimacy, whispers of forgotten children, and a family tree so pruned and rewritten that it no longer resembles the one he tried to plant. And as the Stuart drama unfolded across Europe, France watched, not with horror but with recognition. After all, their own kings had been navigating this delicate dance of paternity and public image for generations. Which brings us to Henri IV of France, a man who treated legitimacy like a suggestion and fatherhood like a state-sponsored sport. Henri IV of France. There are kings who rule through fear and kings who rule through law, and then there was Henri IV of France, who ruled through charm and more than a little mischief. The first monarch of the House of Bourbon, Henri was known as Le Bon Roi Henri, Good King Henry. But if you look past the affectionate nickname, you'll find a man whose reign was marked not just by religious war and reconciliation, but by an extraordinary number of illegitimate children, most of whom lived somewhere between court acceptance and quiet erasure. Henri ruled from 1589 until his assassination in 1610. His reign was a turning point in French history, ending the wars of religion with the Edict of Nantes, rebuilding a broken country and setting the stage for absolutism. But for all his diplomatic achievements, Henri is also remembered for his romantic entanglements, which were prolific even by royal standards. Officially, Henry had 2 legitimate children with his queen, Marie de Medici, Louis XIII, future king and father of Louis XIV, and Elizabeth of France, who would become Queen of Spain. But unofficially, he had at least 12 illegitimate children, possibly more. His affairs were no secret. His mistresses were well known, even celebrated, and his children, while not in line for the throne, were often formally legitimized and integrated into the nobility. Among the most famous was César de Bourbon, born to Gabrielle d'Estrées, Henri's most beloved mistress. Henri openly adored both mother and child. César was legitimized, given the title Duke of Vendôme, and raised at court. He was treated not like an accident, but like a royal supplement, useful, loyal, and fully functional within the Bourbon framework. Other children followed similar paths. Henri's daughter, Catherine Henriette de Bourbon, also born to Gabrielle, was likewise legitimized and married to a duke. These weren't hidden children, they were curated ones. They didn't challenge the throne, but they carried the bloodline outward, marrying into noble houses, securing alliances, and reinforcing the monarchy's reach. And yet, even Henri's generosity had limits. Not all his illegitimate children were legitimized. Some were quietly handed pensions and titles, raised in satellite households, or placed in religious institutions. Henri played favorites. elevating the children of his most politically advantageous mistresses while letting others fade into obscurity. This was not just personal, it was strategic. Henri was rebuilding a fractured France, and every child, legitimate or not, had to serve a purpose. Legitimacy was less about morality and more about functionality. Could this child help the Bourbon cause? Could their mother be useful? If so, acknowledgement followed. If not, a polite silence ensued. And that silence was sharp, because while Henri was open in his affairs, he was calculating in his acknowledgement. The difference between a legitimized duke and a forgotten son was often nothing more than timing and political relevance. It wasn't about affection, it was about control. Henri IV's assassination in 1610 left his legitimate heir, Louis XIII, to inherit the crown, and the headache of managing an ever-expanding royal family tree. Many of Henri's illegitimate children remained powerful nobles throughout the 17th century, shaping French politics from behind gilded doors. Others vanished into quiet wealth or relative obscurity, but all of them, the named and the nameless, were part of a royal pattern. Acknowledge what helps, forget what doesn't. And this model would not die with Henri. His grandson, Louis XIV, would inherit not only the crown, but the blueprint, a monarchy built on grandeur, illusion, and carefully measured paternity. And like his grandfather, Louis would master the art of being both a father and a selective historian. Louis XIV of France. If Henri IV redefined royal fatherhood as a diplomatic tool, then his grandson, Louis XIV, turned it into something else entirely, an institution, an aesthetic, and sometimes an inconvenient afterthought. Known as the Sun King, Louis XIV reigned for over 72 years, the longest of any monarch in European history, and while his image was curated down to the last embroidered hem of his heels, his personal life was a chaos of contradictions. He ruled France with centralized authority, yet his private palace was overflowing with unofficial children, many of whom reflected the very complexities of the power he projected. Louis married just once to Maria Theresa of Spain, who gave him 6 children, though only one, the Dauphin, Louis le Grand Dauphin, survived past childhood. But outside that solemn state-sanctioned union, Louis fathered at least a dozen children by several of his mistresses, most notably Madame de Montespan, Louise de la Vallière, and Madame de Maintenon. Some of these children were legitimized. Others were quietly written out of the narrative, too politically awkward, too ill-timed, or too wrapped in controversy to be of use. The legitimized children were given titles, lands, and in some cases near princely authority. Among them, Louis Auguste de Bourbon, made Duke of Maine, Louis Alexandre de Bourbon, made Count of Toulouse Louise Françoise de Bourbon, married into the Condé family Françoise Marie de Bourbon, married to the Duke of Orléans, her cousin and future regent of France. These children were not hidden. In fact, they became political chess pieces, forged into weapons against the nobility who might question the strength of the Bourbon crown. Their legitimization caused significant resentment among the old aristocracy, especially when Louis XIV tried and failed to push for their inclusion in the royal succession. That push, in fact, became a scandal unto itself. In 1714, near the end of his life, Louis issued a decree granting his 2 legitimized sons, the Dukes of Maine and Toulouse, the right to succeed to the throne if the direct Bourbon line failed. The Parlement of Paris resisted, and after Louis's death, the decree was nullified by the regent, Philippe d'Orléans, himself married to one of Louis's legitimized daughters. The family drama was tight, barbed, and suffocatingly symmetrical. Still, not all of Louis's illegitimate children were brought into the light. Some, especially those born to lesser-known mistresses or those who died young, were omitted from official records. The king who built Versailles as a monument to control could not or would not extend that control to every consequence of his affections. And there was irony in that. Louis XIV ruled with a philosophy of absolutism, l'état c'est moi, yet his own bloodline was populated with children denied the very absolutism he championed. They were treated as semi-royal, included in family alliances, but excluded from full dynastic legitimacy, publicly adorned, privately displaced. But this duality served a purpose. Louis XIV knew how to use his illegitimate children without giving them the full weight of power. They were royal when it helped, non-royal when it didn't. Their identity was elastic, defined not by blood but by usefulness. In death, Louis left behind a kingdom burdened by legacy, a court addicted to ritual, and a family tree so swollen with side branches that it would take generations to prune. And the pruning would come in revolutions, regencies, and republics. But just as France wrestled with its bloated aristocracy, another royal house in Europe was creating its own version of the unacknowledged child, one with the added benefit of espionage, exile, and exile again. Because while Louis XIV turned his offspring into policy, Alfonso XIII of Spain would become entangled in scandal by the simple, unshakable fact that one of his children refused to stay erased. Alfonso XIII of Spain. The Spanish royal family has always had a taste for drama, not the velvet-gloved intrigue of British court life, but the theatrical, high-stakes kind of drama usually reserved for operas and constitutional crises. And few monarchs embodied that flair more than Alfonso XIII, the last reigning king of Spain before the monarchy collapsed under the weight of dictatorship, republicanism and, you guessed it, unacknowledged children. Alfonso XIII was born king in 1886 posthumously after the death of his father, Alfonso XII. His entire childhood was a performance of sovereignty, with regents and court ministers ensuring that the baby monarch would grow into a symbol of national unity. Instead, he grew into a man torn between modernity and monarchy, unable to reconcile the two, and left behind a legacy as fragmented as the country he once ruled. His marriage to Victoria Eugenie of Battenberg, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, was arranged as a diplomatic bridge between Spain and Britain. But the union was deeply unhappy. Victoria Eugenie was a carrier of haemophilia, which passed to several of their children, and Alfonso took this as personal betrayal. He never forgave her. He also never stopped seeking romantic and political diversions elsewhere, and so began a series of extramarital affairs, whispered scandals, and children born on the periphery of royalty, recognized by those who needed favors, ignored by those who needed deniability. The most persistent and publicly vindicated of these was Leandro Alfonso Ruiz Moragas, born in 1929 to actress Carmen Ruiz Moragas. For most of his life, Leandro lived in the shadow of rumor and polite silence. It was known in elite circles that he was the king's son. He bore a striking resemblance. He was given certain privileges, but he was never officially acknowledged. Not while Alfonso was alive. Not during the dictatorship of Franco, not even during the early years of Spain's return to monarchy. It wasn't until the 1980s, decades after Alfonso XIII had died in exile, that Leandro began a public campaign to be recognized as a son of the king. It was a battle of bloodlines fought in courtrooms, not battlefields. In 2003, he won. A Spanish court confirmed his paternity, granting him the right to use the surname Bourbon, a symbolic acknowledgement, if not a political one. But the damage had already been done. For most of his life, Leandro had existed as a ghost in a crown-shaped frame, known but never named. He had watched the Bourbon restoration in Spain happen without him, despite being a direct descendant. His half-nephew, King Juan Carlos I, ruled a country that had systematically denied Leandro's identity for decades. Alfonso XIII's other rumoured children, including alleged daughters and sons born during his exile in Rome, have never been formally confirmed. But the pattern is clear. The Spanish crown, like many others, managed its illegitimate offspring like a state secret, known to many, denied by default, acknowledged only under pressure. What makes Alfonso's case particularly haunting is the generational delay of recognition. Leandro wasn't asking for the throne. He wasn't challenging succession. He simply wanted truth, the kind kings are often too afraid to give. And if Louis XIV turned his bastards into policy, and James II turned his into exiles, then Alfonso XIII turned his into questions that refused to go away. Because royal blood has a tendency to surface, not always in palaces, but in courtrooms, memoirs, and carefully worded legal petitions. And in the north of Europe, another monarch, Christian IV of Denmark, faced the same slow burn of royal discretion and unofficial children. Only in his case, the line between mistress and queen, acknowledgement and denial, would blur until it was barely a line at all. Christian IV of Denmark. Christian IV of Denmark reigned for nearly 60 years, a flamboyant theatrical monarch whose life oscillated between impressive ambition and catastrophic miscalculation. He built cities, started wars, drained the royal treasury, and insisted on dressing like a Renaissance painting brought to life. He also, like so many of his royal peers, had a peculiar approach to fatherhood, acknowledging some of his illegitimate children while conveniently leaving others to history's uncertain footnotes. Born in 1577, Christian ascended to the throne at just 11 years old and ruled from 1588 until 1648. During his reign, Denmark expanded its architectural and cultural footprint, even as its military fortunes crumbled under his leadership in the 30 Years' War. And as Christian's ambitions for Denmark fell short, his domestic pursuits, particularly his romantic ones, only intensified. Christian married Anna Catherine of Brandenburg, with whom he had 7 children, though only a few survived to adulthood. After her death, he took a second wife, Kirsten Monk, not through formal marriage, but through a left-handed morganatic union, which meant their children were not automatically part of the royal succession. Still, their relationship was official enough to produce 12 children, and unofficial enough to produce scandal, betrayal, and at least one assassination attempt. Allegedly. See, this is still Denmark, not a soap opera. But even this sprawling, semi-royal brood didn't represent the full picture. Christian had numerous affairs beyond his relationships with Anna Catherine and Kirsten Monk, and several more children were born from those encounters, children who didn't receive titles, pensions, or invitations to court. Some were quietly absorbed into noble families. Others seem to have vanished from the record entirely, existing only through whispers in local histories or stray baptismal entries. Among the acknowledged children with Kirsten Monk were Leonora Christina, a famously tragic figure who married the powerful noble Corfitz Ulfeldt and later spent decades imprisoned by her royal in-laws. Leonora's writings became a staple of Danish literature, a strange side note to the royal lineage. A daughter born half-royal, lived fully human, and remembered as neither. But the children Christian fathered outside even his morganatic union had no such legacy. Their stories were rarely written, and when they were, it was often in the language of rumour. A boy raised by the court tailor, a girl fostered by a merchant family in Copenhagen, a young man in naval service with a mysterious patron. What Christian IV seemed to master, or at least attempt, was the art of selective acknowledgement. With Kirsten Monk's children, he walked a fine line, granting them noble status and royal favour without ever threatening the legitimate line of succession. With others, he didn't bother walking the line at all. If the child couldn't serve a purpose, politically, diplomatically, emotionally, they were left behind. This strategy might have worked better had Christian not lived quite so long. Over 6 decades of rule gave ample time for scandal to fester. His relationship with Kirsten Monk deteriorated into public disgrace, marked by accusations of infidelity, political scheming, and, in one instance, hiring a witch to curse Christian himself. The king eventually separated from her, replacing her with Vibeke Kruse, a mistress who wielded considerable influence at court and whose own children by Christian were never formally acknowledged. After Christian's death in 1648, Denmark entered a period of political and dynastic cleanup. His legitimate son, Frederick III, became king, and the children of Kirsten Monk, as well as those of Vibeke Kruse, were gradually pushed to the periphery. Some were imprisoned, some married off, and others quietly forgotten. The pattern was predictable. If your claim to royal blood was unofficial, you were only useful as long as you were controllable. In the end, Christian IV left behind more buildings than heirs, more rumours than legacies, and a royal family tree that reads like a palimpsest. Overwritten, redacted, half-remembered. His life was a spectacle, his death a relief, and his unacknowledged children yet another reminder that royal dynasties are often built not just on lineage, but on strategic amnesia. And in the long tradition of monarchs rewriting their family stories, England predictably had its own version. Because if Denmark produced kings who blurred the line between legitimacy and convenience, England's Edward III mastered the art of strategic ambiguity, embedding his own illegitimate children deep within the aristocracy, acknowledged just enough to be useful, but never quite enough to rewrite the succession. Edward III of England. Edward III of England is usually remembered as the warrior king who launched the 100 Years' War, revived the chivalric ideal, and steered England into a new golden age of military ambition and dynastic power. But behind the tournaments and triumphs, the black armour and the Black Death, Edward also left behind a quiet trail of unacknowledged or ambiguously acknowledged children. Royal side notes who drifted through English history without crowns, titles, or clarity. Edward officially reigned from 1327 to 1377, a full 50 years, and had 8 legitimate sons and daughters with his queen, Philippa of Hainault. Among them, Edward, the Black Prince, whose early death threw the line of succession into chaos, John of Gaunt, ancestor of the Lancastrians, and Edmund of Langley, founder of the House of York. The Wars of the Roses were, quite literally, Edward's familial aftershock. But Edward's personal life was not confined to queenly chambers. He had at least one well-documented mistress, Alice Perez, a woman of low birth who rose to startling prominence late in his reign, often described as manipulating the aged king in his final years. Alice was unpopular with the nobility, blamed for corruption and excess, but she was also mother to at least 3 of Edward's children, none of whom were formally acknowledged with titles, and yet they existed. Alice's children, particularly Sir John de Southeray, appear in various royal documents as kinsmen or the king's beloved. John was given lands and married into minor nobility, but never came close to being placed in the line of succession. He was a perfect example of what you might call royal adjacency, close enough to benefit, far enough to be excluded. There are also lingering suggestions of other illegitimate offspring, hinted at in private correspondence, and genealogical oddities. Some nobles in the 15th century claimed descent from Edward III through unspecified lines, almost certainly rooted in non-marital relationships. In medieval England, it wasn't uncommon for the sons of kings to appear as knights with curiously generous land grants or unusually fast military promotions. But unless the king said the words, "This is my son," they remained historical orphans. Why didn't Edward acknowledge these children more fully? It's not as though his dynasty was insecure, quite the opposite. He had a glut of legitimate sons, many of whom produced powerful lines. His queen was respected, his reign was secure, but Edward III was also a political tactician. Acknowledging illegitimate children would have meant sharing royal resources, inviting rivalry, and complicating succession plans already tangled by war and disease. So he chose the path of polite omission. Even Alice Perez, who wielded considerable influence over the king during his final years, could not secure formal status for their children. When Edward died, Alice was banished from court, her possessions confiscated, and her children, whatever favours they once received, quietly receded into the folds of lower nobility. Edward III's case is a study in contrast, a king who expanded England's influence, crafted a dynasty, and celebrated knightly honour, yet allowed his own unofficial children to remain honourable in name only. They were tools of patronage, never heirs, echoes, never declarations, and that royal silence, like so many before it, rippled through history. It whispered through land deeds, echoed in church records, and resurfaced in noble claims centuries later. But Edward was not alone in this quiet strategy, because the kings who followed him and the ones who came before were not building families. They were building legacies, and legacies don't always have room for truth, especially not when that truth might be walking around with your eyes, your blood, and somebody else's name. And next we find a monarch whose legacy lies not in his policies or warfare, but in a single name, Adam Fitzroy, the barely acknowledged son of Edward II, a king whose reign unravelled faster than his father's, and whose personal life remains one of the most quietly controversial in English history. Edward II of England. Few monarchs in English history have provoked as much controversy or confusion as Edward II. His reign, 1307 to 1327, was riddled with mismanagement, military disasters, political vendettas, and the slow disintegration of royal authority. By the time he was forcibly deposed by his own wife and her ally and possible lover, Roger Mortimer, Edward was less a king than a cautionary tale in royal fragility. But tucked between the baronial revolts and battlefield humiliations lies a lesser-known story, one of a son, unacknowledged, who flickers into history and then vanishes. His name was Adam Fitzroy, and he remains one of the most enigmatic figures in Plantagenet genealogy. Adam was not born to Queen Isabella, Edward II's formidable wife, and the mother of his heir, Edward III. His mother's identity is unknown, erased, overlooked, or never recorded in the first place. What we do know is that Adam Fitzroy existed. He appears in royal records in 1322, receiving funds for equipment and other necessities to accompany the king on a military campaign to Scotland. The name Fitzroy itself, literally son of the king, was a common moniker for illegitimate royal sons. And yet, that single campaign entry is one of the only confirmations of his life. No titles, no lands, no legitimization, no further mention after 1322. Adam likely died shortly afterward, either during or following the Scottish campaign. His burial took place at Tynemouth Priory, and a small payment was made to monks for prayers on his behalf. That's it, that's all. In an era obsessed with bloodlines, succession, and dynastic insurance policies, this near-total erasure is striking. Other monarchs, Edward's own father, Edward I, for instance, acknowledged their illegitimate children more openly, granting them lands and sometimes arranging prominent marriages. Edward II did not extend these gestures to Adam, so why the silence? Some historians argue that Edward II's reign was simply too precarious to allow for public acknowledgement of an illegitimate child. By the early 1320s, his authority was in tatters. His controversial favoritism toward Hugh Despenser the Younger had alienated both nobles and commoners. Acknowledging a royal bastard may have seemed like a political liability, a move that could further inflame tensions at court or complicate an already sensitive line of succession. There's also the possibility that Edward didn't know Adam well. The record of Adam's outfitting for military service suggests some level of recognition, but it's unclear how present Edward was in his upbringing, or whether he had much of a relationship with the boy at all. But perhaps the more unsettling truth is this: royal blood alone was never enough. Even a child of a king, if born without the proper mother at the wrong time, or with too little political utility, could be allowed to vanish from history. Adam Fitzroy was not denied. He was simply not included. His brief appearance in the royal accounts is like a sudden flicker on a radar screen, real, indisputable, and followed by silence. And that silence is what has kept Adam in the realm of mystery. His story is a placeholder, a reminder that even those closest to the crown could be functionally invisible if their existence didn't serve the narrative. Edward II himself was not known for strategic brilliance or political foresight. His personal relationships, particularly his intense favoritism toward male courtiers, earned him criticism, suspicion, and ultimately rebellion. His reign was less about long-term dynasty building and more about survival through short-term loyalty, which makes Adam Fitzroy's omission even more interesting. If Edward was so eager to please his inner circle, why not elevate a son who might have solidified his image as a virile, legitimate ruler? One answer may be that Adam's very existence clashed with Edward's public persona, a persona increasingly scrutinized and picked apart by rivals. Acknowledging a child born outside his queen's lineage may have raised too many questions, or perhaps it was simply too late in Edward's collapsing reign to make a difference. So Adam remains where so many royal illegitimate children reside, on the margins of history, confirmed but not included, real but not remembered. And yet his story survives, not through titles or tombs, but through a single line in a financial ledger. Proof that he existed, that he marched with the army, that someone paid for his boots and bridle, and that's often all these children were allowed. A line in a ledger, a whisper in an archive. But not all monarchs were quite so passive in their omissions. In Scotland, the approach to illegitimacy was, in some ways, even more pragmatic. Because there, bastards weren't just acknowledged, they were often armed, educated, and placed just far enough from the throne to avoid catastrophe. And no dynasty played this game more frequently than the Scottish kings of the late medieval period, especially those like James IV, whose court was populated with sons of bishops, daughters of mistresses, and half-siblings who carried the royal blood like a quiet secret. The Scottish kings, James IV and others. When it comes to medieval Scotland, lineage was currency, but legitimacy was flexible. The kings of Scotland, particularly from the House of Stuart, seemed to understand something their English counterparts never quite admitted. A royal bastard might not inherit the throne, but he could still win a war. And so, many Scottish kings, including James IV, James V, and others before them, openly acknowledged their illegitimate children, gave them lands, and in some cases handed them power. But acknowledgement, even here, didn't mean equality, it meant utility. Let's begin with James IV, who ruled from 1488 to 1513. He was a cultured and politically savvy monarch who presided over a Scottish Renaissance, commissioned art, invited foreign scholars, and flirted with naval expansion. But while he was polishing the image of a modern king, he was also fathering numerous children outside of marriage, and doing so with very little secrecy. James IV had at least 7 illegitimate children by various mistresses, most notably Marion Boyd, Margaret Drummond, and Isabel Stewart. These children weren't hidden in monasteries or farmsteads, they were placed in powerful positions. His son James Stewart, for instance, became Archbishop of St. Andrews, one of the most powerful clerical positions in the country. Another, Alexander Stewart, was appointed Lord Chancellor of Scotland and was groomed for leadership from a young age. This wasn't scandalous, it was strategic. James IV's court was a maze of half-siblings and royal cousins, many of whom had no claim to the throne but still served as political tools. By elevating his illegitimate children into religious and political office, James strengthened the monarchy's grip on Scotland's internal power structures. And yet, there were limits. None of these children were placed in the line of succession. That space was preserved for James V, his legitimate son, by Margaret Tudor, sister of Henry VIII. The lines were clear, but they were flexible in practice. A royal bastard could hold a bishopric, govern a region, or lead an army. He could be educated, enriched, and ennobled, but he could not be crowned. This system wasn't unique to James IV. His father, James III, had also had illegitimate children, though fewer. His son, James V, would repeat the pattern, fathering numerous children out of wedlock, many of whom would grow up to play important roles in church and court. The Scottish kings understood something vital. Acknowledging a child did not mean relinquishing control. It meant gaining influence. It meant filling the chessboard with pieces loyal to the crown, even if they couldn't inherit it. But there was always a cost. The more illegitimate children were empowered, the more the nobility grew restless. Questions of legitimacy, though legally clear, became emotionally and politically thorny. And in the centuries to follow, claims of descent from royal bastards would ripple through Scottish noble families like a slow-burning inheritance dispute, especially once the legitimate male line died out and everyone began rummaging through the genealogical junk drawer for proof of royal blood. In short, Scottish kings didn't hide their bastards. They weaponized them. And while that approach may seem bold, even enlightened, it raises its own haunting question. What happens to a child when his name is both a privilege and a prison? When he's raised to serve a throne he can never sit on, because legitimacy isn't just about law, it's about belonging, and in the royal world, belonging was always temporary. And as we cross from the Gaelic Highlands to the meticulously regulated courts of Japan, we find another royal tradition shaped by blood, silence, and political amnesia. Because some Japanese emperors are rumored to have had children who vanished from the historical record, not by scandal, but by design. Japanese emperors, speculative cases. In the vast historical silence that surrounds Japan's imperial family, the most notable absence might be this: scandal. For a dynasty that claims to stretch back over 2,600 years, older than Rome, older than Christianity, older than even most myths, there is a strange, almost supernatural smoothness to its official history. But behind the chrysanthemum crest and the ceremonial stillness lies an unspoken reality. Even the most sacred bloodlines produce inconvenient children. And in Japan, inconvenience was something to be managed with silence. Unlike the drama-heavy courts of Europe, the Imperial House of Japan built its survival on an entirely different kind of narrative: immutability. The emperor wasn't a politician. He wasn't even technically a ruler for most of recorded history. He was a symbol, a presence, a divine conduit. And because of that, his personal life was less subject to gossip and more subject to systematic erasure. Which is why the subject of unacknowledged imperial children is so difficult to pin down. Officially, the Japanese imperial family has always maintained a strict and often painfully curated record of its legitimate lineage. Emperors were polygamous in ancient and medieval times, taking multiple consorts who were classified and ranked with dizzying precision. Children born of high-ranking consorts could enter the line of succession. Others were absorbed into the court bureaucracy, or married off, or sent to monastic life. The goal was not just control, it was containment. But some children didn't even make it that far. Historians point to multiple instances where rumors persist of offspring born to court ladies, concubines, or even servants whose names were never recorded in public archives. In some cases, this wasn't accidental. It was policy. Take, for example, the case of Emperor Go-Daigo, reigned 1318 to 1339, a notoriously ambitious monarch who openly challenged the shogunate. He had numerous consorts and fathered over a dozen children. Several of them, such as Emperor Go Murakami, are well known, but others exist in quasi-historical twilight, mentioned briefly in temple records or attached to obscure noble houses generations later with no clear origin. Even further back, during the Heian period, 794 to 1185, emperors such as Emperor Uda and Emperor Daigo reportedly fathered children outside of court-sanctioned unions. Some of these children were quietly adopted by noble families, absorbed into clans like the Fujiwara or Minamoto, and given carefully curated genealogies. Their imperial blood was never publicly claimed, but it served a function, one that allowed powerful families to reinforce their status with whispered lineage. Why this pattern of quiet concealment? Because in Japan, the concept of keisho, succession, not only emphasized birth, but legitimacy of rank, timing, and ceremony. A child born to a concubine of low status or outside of prescribed rituals was often excluded regardless of blood, and unlike European kings who might acknowledge illegitimate children to flex their virility or form alliances, Japanese emperors were expected to be distant, aloof, and almost non-human in their emotional life. Acknowledging an illegitimate child would be an admission of fallibility, not biologically, but morally. But rumors persist. In the Edo period, when the Tokugawa shogunate reduced the emperor to a figurehead with no political power, several imperial family members were rumored to have had children through unofficial unions. These children were often raised in Buddhist temples or handed over to samurai families loyal to the court. Their names were sometimes recorded in private diaries, like those of court ladies or low-ranking officials, but rarely in official imperial records. Even into the modern era, the practice of quiet concealment continued. During the Meiji Restoration, as the imperial family reasserted its power under Emperor Meiji, there were rumors of illegitimate children fathered by princes and high-ranking family members, especially during the militarization of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These claims were never confirmed, nor were they intended to be. The imperial institution had become more symbolic than ever, and symbolism could not afford to bleed, which leads to the central paradox of the Japanese imperial line. Its authority was built on continuity, but its continuity was built on selective forgetting. These unacknowledged children weren't threats, they were liabilities. Their erasure wasn't personal, it was systemic. Because when your entire national mythology depends on the illusion of unbroken divine lineage, the existence of unofficial branches isn't a scandal, it's an impossibility. And impossibilities in royal systems are often the most carefully preserved lies. But Japan is not unique in this. Across the globe, another royal system perfected the art of hidden offspring, not for myth, but for power. The Ottoman sultans, whose empire spanned continents, didn't hide their children in shame. They housed them in palaces, trained them for rule, and then, more often than not, eliminated them. Unless, of course, they were born to a concubine of the wrong rank at the wrong time, in which case they simply disappeared before history ever noticed. Ottoman sultans. If the Japanese emperors erased their unofficial children to preserve a myth, the Ottoman sultans erased theirs to preserve the throne. The Ottoman Empire at its peak was not a country, it was a machine, with the Sultan as both supreme sovereign and spiritual leader. And within this machine, childbearing was statecraft and motherhood was politics. But not every child born into the gilded latticework of Topkapi Palace was destined to wield power, or even survive infancy. Because in this system, acknowledgement was not about love or duty or even biology, it was about timing. The Ottoman system of succession was famously brutal. Unlike European monarchies, which followed primogeniture, the eldest son inherits, the Ottoman approach was more Darwinian. Any son of the Sultan could, in theory, inherit the throne, which meant every son was also a potential rival and therefore a potential target. At the heart of this system was the harem, a labyrinthine court within the palace where the Sultan's concubines lived and competed for favor. These women were not wives, but royal consorts, often slaves, captured or gifted from across the empire. Their children, especially sons, were raised in relative seclusion, watched over by eunuchs and court officials, and for some time they waited for acknowledgement. If a concubine's son showed promise, or if the political winds favored his mother's allies, he might be publicly acknowledged, trained in statecraft, and dispatched to govern a province as a Sanjak Bey. This was a rite of passage, a stepping stone toward possible rule. But if not, he might simply remain in the palace, unnamed, unmentioned. A ghost prince. Some died in childhood, some were quietly removed, others lived in the shadows, their status never confirmed, their names rarely recorded. And then there were the truly tragic cases, sons born to mothers who had fallen out of favor or during politically unstable times, whose existence was deliberately hidden. If a sultan feared civil war, or even the illusion of descent, he might withhold acknowledgement entirely, even from his own blood. By the 17th century, this system evolved into something even more macabre, the kayphase, or cage, a section of the palace where male heirs were confined for life. Here, unacknowledged sons could spend decades in luxurious isolation, neither imprisoned nor free, with their very existence unknown to the public. They were kept in reserve, in case a crisis required a new heir. Otherwise, they were allowed to fade, and fade they did. Some sultans fathered dozens of children. Records suggest Mehmed III had over 100, but many of these never received formal titles or public roles. Their names appear in fragments, notes by Venetian diplomats, harem inventories, burial records. Some were acknowledged only after death. Others were absorbed into the military or clerical ranks, unlinked from their royal origins entirely. In some cases, the erasure was political. In others, it was simply practical. The Ottoman harem was a system designed to produce heirs, not children. Those who could be used were raised. Those who couldn't were forgotten before they ever had the chance to be remembered. This wasn't cruelty exactly, it was calculus. And so, generation after generation, the Ottoman Empire perfected a dynasty of partially remembered people. Children born of concubines whose names history forgot, who lived and died within palace walls lined with secrets, whose existence remains half-whispered, half-invented. Because in the Ottoman world, acknowledgement wasn't a right, it was a gamble, and the stakes were nothing less than the empire itself. Mongol Khans, Genghis Khan, and his successors. If European monarchies treated illegitimate children like threats to the bloodline, and Asian dynasties treated them like cracks in divine porcelain, the Mongol Khans operated on an entirely different principle: volume. The empire of Genghis Khan and his descendants was not built on legalism or divine right. It was built on conquest, mobility, and lineage, measured more by loyalty than legitimacy. In other words, if you could ride a horse and claim descent from the great Khan, you were already halfway there. But therein lies the paradox. While Genghis Khan's name became synonymous with virility, strength, and imperial dominance, many of his alleged children, particularly those born outside his formal wives, simply vanished into history. Not because they were scandalous, but because the record-keeping system wasn't designed to remember them. Genghis Khan officially had 4 sons, with his chief wife, Burta, Joki, Chagatai, Ogedei, and Tolui. These sons formed the nucleus of the Mongol imperial succession. They were generals, governors, and later Khagans. Their lines led to powerful Khanates, the Golden Horde, the Ilkhanate, the Chagatai Khanate, and the Yuan dynasty in China. Their descendants are catalogued, chronicled, and debated by historians to this day. But Genghis also had many secondary wives and concubines, upwards of 500, according to some sources. And while these unions produced children, many of those sons were never listed, never acknowledged, and never formally included in the dynastic structure. Why? Because Mongol inheritance was heavily skewed in favor of the children of the chief wife. Berta's sons held primacy. Everyone else, useful when needed, expendable when not. One of the most contested figures in this murky family tree is Jochi, the eldest son of Berta. Captured shortly before Jochi's birth, Berta had been held by an enemy tribe, and though Genghis acknowledged Jochi as his own, doubts about his paternity never fully disappeared. This single ambiguity would ripple through Mongol history, affecting alliances, succession decisions, and eventually the fragmentation of the empire. It's a reminder that even in a system where bloodline was supposedly less rigid, the question of whose son are you still mattered, and for the many other children born to concubines, second wives, or one-night encampment stays across the steppe. Most of them were never officially recorded. Some may have been absorbed into noble families. Others possibly died in battle. Still others lived out their lives as minor chieftains or provincial warlords, Mongol by blood but anonymous by name. Modern genetic studies add a strange twist to this story. A 2003 paper found that nearly 16 million men worldwide share a particular Y chromosome pattern believed to have originated from Genghis Khan or one of his close male relatives. The findings suggest that Genghis may have had thousands descendants, many of whom were never formally recognized. These men carried the blood of the empire, even if the empire never acknowledged them. Which raises the real question. In a society where conquest was the currency and succession was decided more by strength than ceremony, what did acknowledgement even mean? For the Mongol Khans, recognition wasn't about crowns, it was about command. If a son could lead troops and claim allegiance, he didn't need a scroll to prove his birthright. But that pragmatism came with consequences. After Genghis's death in 1227, the empire fractured under the weight of dynastic ambition. His grandsons, most of them legitimate, some possibly not, fought for control. And as the lines blurred between official heirs and unofficial offspring, the empire that had once swept across Eurasia began to devour itself. By the 14th century, Mongol rulers were still claiming descent from Genghis, often through questionable genealogies. Some forged lineage charts, others relied on oral histories. In a world where being a son of the Khan was a free pass to legitimacy, the temptation to invent ancestry became overwhelming. And yet, the actual sons, the unacknowledged, unrecorded ones, faded into obscurity. Their lives lost in the swirl of steppe politics, their bloodline erased by the very empire that birthed them. Because even in a world built on conquest, not every conqueror's child is remembered. Some are swallowed by the grasslands, others vanish between scrolls, and some are never known to begin with. But Genghis Khan wasn't the only monarch with forgotten branches in his family tree. In the courts of Europe, particularly among the minor German principalities, a different kind of silence settled. Less about conquest, more about etiquette, less about war, more about saving face. European minor princely families, German principalities. In the glittering chaos of European royalty, the spotlight often rests on the big players, France, England, Austria, Spain. But beneath that polished surface lies a sprawling network of minor princely families, especially in the German-speaking territories, where titles like Duke of Saxe whatever and Margrave of something unpronounceable held just enough power to matter and just enough obscurity to hide things. Chief among them, unacknowledged children, tucked behind tapestries of protocol and papered over by generations of selective amnesia. The Holy Roman Empire, in particular, was a maze of duchies, electorates, free cities, and principalities, all ruled by minor royals with impressive titles and extremely complicated family arrangements. These courts had just enough wealth to entertain mistresses and courtiers, but not always enough power to withstand the fallout of a scandal. So when a love child appeared, the standard approach was simple: don't ask, don't tell, relocate. One of the most infamous examples comes from the House of Wettin, which ruled various territories in Saxony and Thuringia. Several Wettin princes were known for maintaining long-term relationships with women outside their marriages, often producing children who were later married off to lower nobility or quietly integrated into the civil service. Some received pensions, others received silence. Take the case of Prince Franz of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, a minor noble whose descendants would later include Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. While France is not remembered for scandal, his extended family, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries, was rife with rumoured illegitimate births, often explained away by sudden adoptions, suspiciously fast marriages, or wards who just happened to resemble their guardians a little too closely. The mechanisms of erasure were subtle but effective. Household transfers. Children would be moved to live with loyal retainers, given new names and raised as distant cousins or unrelated charges. Matrilineal disguises. Their lineage would be traced only through their mothers, avoiding any mention of paternal origin. Financial codes. Secret stipends were often hidden in estate ledgers under vague categories like education expenses or family annuities. These children were not invisible. They were conspicuously absent, pointedly omitted from family portraits, court records, and succession charts. But within court gossip and regional folklore, they often took on mythic proportions. The bastard who should have inherited, the secret daughter of the duke, the illegitimate son who became a general or a scholar. In many cases, the silence wasn't even malicious. It was logistical. These principalities relied on marital alliances to survive politically. Acknowledging an illegitimate child risked destabilizing succession, alienating allies, or jeopardizing diplomatic marriages. So discretion wasn't just a preference, it was policy. Yet paradoxically, many of these princely houses still made quiet provisions for their unofficial offspring. They were educated, supported, and sometimes even favoured in private, but never in public. The distance between affection and acknowledgement was precisely measured and rarely crossed. By the 19th century, as the concept of monarchy began to shift under the pressures of nationalism and constitutionalism, these hidden children started to re-emerge, not always by name but by pattern. The sudden elevation of a trusted aide, the mysterious inheritance of a remote estate, the whispered claim of royal descent by someone with a striking nose and a suspiciously generous pension. Today, genealogists trawl through dusty archives trying to untangle the truth. But the deeper they dig, the more they find that the pattern holds. Blood was never the problem, visibility was. A royal could father 10 children, but only the ones written into the family Bible counted. And if your name wasn't there, you were a ghost, well-fed perhaps, but a ghost all the same. Because in these principalities, as in so many monarchies, the line between family and fiction was drawn not with blood, but with ink. And in the frozen palaces of the Russian Empire, the stakes were even higher. Because for the Tsars of Russia, denying a child wasn't just about etiquette or politics, it was about survival. Tsars of Russia, the Romanovs loved order, but they ruled through chaos. It was their calling card. Grand balls in St. Petersburg, while serfs starved in the fields. Divine autocracy framed by whispered palace coups, gilded portraits hiding generational trauma. And behind the ermine-trimmed portraits of Tsars of Russia, particularly from the 18th and 19th centuries, there lies another carefully disguised contradiction. The illegitimate children they never publicly acknowledged, but rarely truly ignored. Russia's monarchy was not shy about producing heirs. In fact, they often produced too many sons, too many daughters, and more than a few too many complications. And yet, unlike their European neighbors, the Romanovs never quite developed a formal system for legitimizing or publicly incorporating their extramarital children. Instead, they leaned on the age-old imperial method, strategic silence. This was not because the Russian Tsars were especially moralistic, quite the opposite. They were powerful, untouchable, and notoriously cavalier in their personal lives. But the Russian throne was one of the few monarchies that actively feared ambiguity. In a country where revolutions brewed in whispers and succession crises often ended in assassination, even acknowledging the existence of a rival bloodline was a kind of political suicide. Still, the children existed. Let's begin with Tsar Alexander I, the Napoleonic-era monarch who defeated the French emperor and promptly retired into a life of spiritual crisis. Rumors swirled that he faked his death and became a Siberian hermit. Less discussed, but equally persistent, are the claims that he fathered at least 2 children outside his marriage, one of whom may have become an officer in the imperial army under a different name. These claims were never verified, of course. They weren't meant to be. But the rumors kept pace with the legacy, tucked like footnotes beneath history's headlines. His successor, Tsar Nicholas I, was more conservative, more paranoid, and arguably even more secretive. Though deeply attached to the image of an upright, pious monarch, Nicholas is believed to have had at least 1 child outside his marriage, raised discreetly, possibly abroad, and almost certainly funded by private imperial channels. But it was under Tsar Alexander II, the so-called Tsar Liberator, that the line between acknowledgement and denial grew most morally ambiguous. While he ruled, Alexander II championed reform. He abolished serfdom, modernized the legal system, and attempted to drag Russia into the 19th century without breaking it entirely. Privately, however, he maintained a long-standing relationship with his mistress, Catherine Dolgorukova, with whom he had 4 children, all before he made her his morganatic wife after the death of his first empress. These children were later given the title Prince and Princess Yurievsky, but they were never part of the official succession, nor were they fully accepted by the imperial family. They lived in an in-between space, known, titled, respected, but always othered. After Alexander II was assassinated, the imperial court made quick work of marginalizing his second family. His son and successor, Alexander III, showed them no favor, and the nobility, already unsettled by the Tsar's progressive reforms, treated the Yurievsky children as polite inconveniences. They had the blood, but not the place. And then came Nicholas II, the last Tsar whose family was annihilated in the Russian Revolution. While Nicholas is generally thought to have led a relatively monogamous life with Empress Alexandra, even he wasn't free from rumors. Several women, including one in France and another in Crimea, would later claim to have borne his children. Most of these claims were dismissed as opportunism in the wake of the Romanov fall. But as with so many dynasties, the truth didn't need to be proven to have power. What separates the Romanovs from their European counterparts is that their illegitimate children, real or rumored, rarely fought for public space. They didn't write memoirs. They didn't try to reclaim titles. They were absorbed, erased, or transformed into legends whispered in émigré drawing rooms long after the dynasty had fallen. And yet they mattered, because the Romanovs ruled a country where blood could ignite revolutions, where names could save you or destroy you, and where being a son of a Tsar could mean you were next in line or first in line for exile. In Russia, you didn't need to be acknowledged to be dangerous, you just needed to be possible. And that brings us to the final stop on our royal tour. A wide-reaching, hazy category of monarchs spread across medieval Iberia, where history and myth overlap so tightly even modern historians can't always tell whose blood was royal, whose claim was true and whose children were simply too politically inconvenient to ever be named. Kings of medieval Europe, the Iberian kingdoms. The Iberian Peninsula, long before it became the modern states of Spain and Portugal, was a checkerboard of Christian and Muslim kingdoms: Leon, Castile, Aragon, Navarre, Galicia, and more, locked in an eternal war of succession, religious identity, and family pride. And within this sprawling, shape-shifting map, royal children were born as tools, weapons, and sometimes liabilities, especially when they arrived outside of marriage. If England specialized in discrete sidelines and France in legitimization, the Iberian kings developed a third path: selective public acknowledgement with highly localized consequences. Many Iberian monarchs, particularly in the 11th through 14th centuries, had numerous illegitimate children, often by noble mistresses. Some of these children went on to play pivotal roles in military campaigns, especially during the Reconquista, when Christian kingdoms pushed southward against Islamic rule. Royal bastards in Iberia were often used as military governors, assigned border regions, or given minor titles as rewards for loyalty. They were acknowledged not out of sentiment, but out of pragmatism. Take Alfonso X of Castile, known as El Sabio, the Wise. Though married to Violent of Aragon, Alfonso fathered several children out of wedlock, including Martin Alfonso de Castilla, who was given lands and a measure of status but barred from succession. Alfonso's court was filled with scholars, poets, and clerics, but his genealogical diplomacy was just as nuanced. His illegitimate children were often woven into the noble class, but not elevated beyond their usefulness. Or consider Pedro I of Castile, often called Pedro the Cruel by his enemies and Pedro the Just by his supporters. He openly acknowledged some illegitimate children, like Don Fadrique, who became master of the Order of Santiago, but others were whispered about and never officially recorded. His reign was marked by brutal purges and shifting alliances. In such a volatile climate, public acknowledgement of a bastard child could be fatal for either the child or the king. Even more complicated was the relationship between the Christian monarchs and their Muslim counterparts in Al-Andalus. During moments of truce and cultural exchange, interfaith unions, both official and unofficial, sometimes produced children who were neither fully royal nor entirely illegitimate, but who nonetheless vanished into the cracks of diplomatic history. Portugal, too, had its share of royal discretion. King John I, founder of the House of Aviz, was himself the illegitimate son of King Pedro I and Teresa Lorenzo. Despite this, he rose to the throne with broad noble support and became a pivotal figure in the Portuguese age of discovery. Ironically, even as an illegitimate heir, he repeated the pattern, fathering several children outside of marriage, some of whom played key roles in exploration and diplomacy, while others were quietly buried in obscure records. Across the peninsula, acknowledgement often followed a familiar pattern. If the child could fight, they were acknowledged as a commander. If they could marry well, they became diplomatic assets. If they caused political tension, they were given a title and sent far away. And if they were inconvenient in every direction, they were forgotten. These weren't just kings, they were chess masters, treating their children like pawns, bishops, or expendable knights. The fact that these children were unacknowledged didn't mean they were unloved, but it did mean they were unscripted. And in an era where control of narrative was everything, being left out of the story was its own kind of sentence. Because in Iberia, as in every royal court, the crown could not afford to recognize every shadow with its blood. Some legacies were written in gold leaf, others were scratched in the margins, waiting for someone centuries later to read between the lines.